Welcome back. This is our third panel, and we will assess U.S. national security risk posed by investment in Chinese companies. First, we'll hear from Mr. Jason Arterburn, Program Director at C4ADS. Then we'll hear from Nathan Piskarik, co-founder of Horizon Advisory and Senior Fellow with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And thirdly, we'll hear from Emily Weinstein, Research Analyst at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technologies. Thank you all for your testimony today. And I will remind you that you have 7 minutes, and the commissioners each have 5 in questioning you. So, Jason, can we start with you?
Great. Thank you to the Commission for the invitation to provide testimony in today's hearing. It is a privilege to represent our work at C4ADS on a topic of such importance. Today, I've been asked to address an area of vital importance to national security, and one that I believe that with the right approaches, we could be much better positioned to address. And that is the Chinese government's co-option of what has been traditionally understood as private sector enterprises in the ways that it impinges on U.S. national security interests. I would like to acknowledge that I provide this testimony amidst a wave of racially motivated violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, including the terrible tragedy in Atlanta this week. For those of us who are working to confront national security risks from China, it is more important than ever that we treat this challenge with the rigor, nuance, and vigilance that it requires, as in precisely framing this issue may lead to ineffective policy responses at best, or contribute to continued violence that undermines our values at worst. In recent years, there's been a significant amount of research on the key companies, universities, institutions, and government offices that are involved in China's military-industrial base, and on how those enterprises have deliberately pursued China's national security interests around the world. I'm indebted to this research, but for the purposes of my testimony today, I'd like to complement this existing body of work by setting those enterprises in the context of more recent changes in China's domestic political economy. My goal here is to outline and draw attention to the more banal ways the United States and its allies are exposed to national security risks, even in the absence of deliberate operations by the CCP. Specifically, I'd like to focus my remarks today on 2 key points. The first is that China's domestic political economy poses systemic national security risks to the United States and other liberal democracies with market-oriented economic systems. The second is that publicly available information will be indispensable in our efforts to address threats that emerge from China's commercial sector. That is because publicly available information can not only produce actionable insights about threats in China's corporate environment, but also can be cheaply collected and easily shared with the growing range of stakeholders who we need to help mitigate risk, whether they be new agencies in government, leaders in industry at universities, or partners in allied countries around the world. Now to my first point. China's political economy creates systemic national security risks in the United States because special deals between local governments and Chinese enterprises are an endemic feature of the commercial ecosystem. But the nature of that risk is difficult to define. Because China has weak formal market institutions, Chinese companies have relied on special deals with local governments in order to survive, compete, and grow in the domestic market. Scholars have described this special deal system as such. Local governments who seek political achievements compete with other local governments to attract businesses to their region. To do so, they create protectionist and preferential policies or provide access to capital. Private entrepreneurs accept special deals with local governments because they provide market protections that don't otherwise exist. And as those companies grow and pursue access in other local markets, they create new deals with other local governments. Over 3 decades, this special deal system of public-private collusion has been one of the main driving forces behind China's growth. But as companies now pursue globalization, it creates 2 serious national security consequences for the United States and other liberal democracies with market-oriented economic systems. First, China's special deal system has given rise to massive, sprawling networks of companies with complex relationships to the state at multiple levels of governance. In fact, according to one study, the average size of the largest 100 conglomerates in China increased from 500 companies in 1995 to 15,000 companies in 2015. As a result, it is now difficult through equity ownership analysis alone to determine who ultimately controls a company or to understand how different companies relate to one another within massive corporate networks. Second, private enterprises face financial incentives to work closely with state owners and investors, which may lead to political exposure or entanglements whose national security implications are difficult to assess. Using corporate registration data, researchers at the University of Chicago assessed that while privately held capital in China has grown significantly as a proportion of China's economy over the last 2 decades, it has only done so for private investors who are proximate to the state in their commercial ventures. These findings suggest that while the party state may not directly control private investors, successful private investors may have varying degrees of political exposure, which may or may not ultimately pose a national security risk. So in this context, we face 2 key challenges in our effort to understand and respond to risk in China's commercial environment. The first is diagnostic, namely, how do we define the threat? How exactly does the party state relate to commercial enterprises or research institutes? And under what conditions can and can't the party state instrumentalize those enterprises to pursue its national security objectives? The second is prescriptive on how we develop a policy response. If risk is systemic, what generalizable heuristics can we use to reduce China's massive corporate and research environment into a manageable pool of only the highest risk entities for closer scrutiny and review? In this regard, I argue that publicly available information will be indispensable in our ability to both diagnose the threats that emerge from China's commercial environment and to prescribe tailored policy or enforcement responses. In making this argument, I echo unclassified recommendations from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in their September 2020 China Deep Dive, which states that open source information will be critical to keeping up with expanding intelligence requirements on China and in engaging a broader range of non-traditional intelligence consumers who have roles to play in risk mitigation. While some have previously recommended to the Commission that the U.S. government use open source information more broadly, those recommendations have focused primarily on academic articles, Chinese policy documents, gray literature, and other sources of information that fall in the traditional open source collection taxonomy. But there exists a tremendous amount of other data sources available in the public domain that can be collected cheaply at scale, which can provide valuable context about a company's relationship to the party state. In my written testimony, I provide significantly more detail about the ways that the party state directly and indirectly participates in the commercial ecosystem. I also analyze how those forms of participation create observable indicators for policymakers and regulators who seek to proactively identify and mitigate risk from publicly available sources, both at the industry and the company level. But to use those new sources of data effectively, we will face technical, policy, and cultural challenges. And to overcome them, I recommend that the United States develop a national data strategy that is attentive to the increasing volume of high-value, publicly available data sets from China. Examples of those data sets include Chinese corporate records that are free to access and contain detailed shareholder director information, and a number of other sources that I outline in my testimony. In addition to thinking about new sources of data abroad, our data strategy must also pay special attention to how we capture data at home, where even minor changes in how we record records can dramatically improve and accelerate the due diligence process. I look forward to continuing to engage with the community of scholars, policymakers, and practitioners who are working on this issue and using the data and technology tools at our disposal to pursue better answers to these difficult questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Nate, are you prepared?
Hearing chairs Fiedler and Borochoff, distinguished commissioners and staff of the commission, it is an honor to participate in today's hearing. I aim to emphasize 2 fundamental points in my remarks and look forward to offering additional examples and details in discussion. Bilateral capital flows between the United States and China represent a novel feature and one with novel importance in a broader national security context. Secondly, as in most domains of integration, the Chinese Communist Party deliberately pursues asymmetric positioning in international capital flows. To underscore a bottom line up front, I'm concerned that the national security community lacks appropriate analytic frameworks for assessing the impact of capital market integration in the U.S.-China contest. This commission and Congress have a vital role to play in collecting and sharing relevant information, promulgating new reporting and legally mandated disclosure requirements, and perhaps most critically, informing the U.S. public about the scope of connections between U.S. domiciled pools of capital and China's national security apparatus. The risk apparent in bilateral capital flows indicate that U.S.-China economic relations require a systemic recalibration as a part of a broader competitive strategy for a long-term peacetime competition. The U.S. national security establishment is determined that the PRC presents a great power threat. The language used to describe the China threat, including the great power competition label, harkens back to the Cold War. There are certainly similarities. In the Cold War, of course, the U.S. faced off against a communist regime intent on rewriting the global order. However, today's contest is not the Cold War. Where the U.S. response to the Soviet Union was able to orient around containment, Today's competitive environment is one of integration and unprecedented structural interdependence. The CCP's competitive strategy hinges on weaponizing that integration and interdependence. China is orders of magnitude more economically integrated today than was the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Soviet Union sought a self-sufficient national economy, which typically generated a minimal international trade volume that accounted for around 5% of overall economic activity. Since the early 1990s, in comparison, China has held a trade-to-GDP ratio of 30%. This difference is reflected in capital flows as well. The global stall caused by COVID-19 prompted flows of capital into China to accelerate in 2020, and the PRC overtook the United States as the top destination for foreign direct investment for the first time. These are non-trivial differences with the insular Soviet economy. China is not the Soviet Union. The CCP does not contain itself. But that question of greater versus lesser integration is just one part of the story. Another that demands new frameworks for national security analysis is of the type of integration and the U.S. government's relationship to it. Much of the exchange between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War took place in domains where governmental restrictions could be enforced when a national security imperative was clearly and consistently invoked. That may no longer be the case. The strategic environment has changed. U.S. financial intermediaries of all stripes invest in China's public market equities and debt, as well as private market equity and debt in China. Passive fund managers incorporate the Chinese market as a vital component of mainstream allocation strategies. So do investors who more actively manage funds and portfolios, including those in private markets. A range of prominent U.S. private equity and venture capital investors, for example, invest in and alongside actors in China with ties to the military-civil fusion enterprise. Few of these avenues of capital integration feature any explicit awareness of or mitigation against risks associated with China's military-civil fusion strategy. This capital integration benefits China's military's cost of capital. At the same time, a class of military-civil fusion contributors are positioned to enjoy proximity to critical U.S.-based technology, infrastructure, and data. These factors support China's development of comprehensive national power. The ease with which they are supported by U.S. capital investment represents a strategic failure that, if corrected, could impose costs on Beijing's development of comprehensive national power. China's integration with global capital markets also impacts its cost of empire, a potentially critical factor in a long-time peacetime competition. The Soviet Union's closed system created sunk costs and economic burden that ultimately weighed on the ruling regime's efficacy and survival. By contrast, capital integration and the broader state-led, enterprise-driven economic model refined by the CCP may allow Beijing to enjoy modes of imperial expansion and tactical control over populations with a cost profile drastically different from other historical cases. For example, the CCP's control of its population through means including, but not limited to, reproductive policy, patriotic education, propaganda, forced labor, and high-tech-enabled monitoring and policing stands to benefit from technological advance. If China is able to use cutting-edge technology to perfect and automate elements of its surveillance state, Beijing's overall cost structure will benefit from an economy of scale. If China is able to obtain such cutting-edge technology, at least in part through integration into global private and public capital markets, it could in fact turn a profit in the process. Right now, U.S. capital, wittingly or not, contributes to China's military-civil fusion program. Passively managed index funds commonly invested in by U.S. persons and institutions have been reported to hold billions of dollars of equity in companies designated by DoD as communist Chinese military companies. These index funds draw capital from a range of U.S. sources, including, in all likelihood, the retirement savings of individuals here today. This means, first, that a U.S. index fund, and by extension its investors, provide capital to China's military-civil fusion program. They directly decrease the cost of capital for operating a Chinese military company. Second, the interests of that fund and its investors become tied to those of China's military-civil fusion apparatus. To take one example, Vanguard's Emerging Markets Stock Index Fund offers an instructive case that is common across other similar investment vehicles that incorporate international equities within framework of technology, growth, emerging market, or China-centric investment themes. The fund has featured stakes in several companies designated by DoD as tied to the Chinese military, including the surveillance firm Hikvision. The fund also invests in the strategic and military relevant companies like those that provide Beijing a stranglehold over rare earth element extraction and processing globally. Vanguard's Emerging Markets Stock Index Fund features Class A shares of one such player, China Northern Rare Earth Group. While DoD has not designated any of China's rare earth players as communist Chinese military companies, it's clear that those actors support China's industrial policy and the military civil fusion program. U.S. sources of capital investing into actors like Hikvision, China Northern Rare Earth, and the likes of Liar, a Chinese chemical player affiliated with the Chinese Academy of Engineering Physics, is counterproductive on any and every metric of importance in the context of long-term competition with China. And this is just one class of example where U.S. funds support Chinese military's cost of capital and cost of empire. Private market investment is discussed in other panels and reflected in the exposure of prominent investment funds present additional examples that feed into Beijing's apparatus for developing military power and present additional sources for us to continue to monitor and respond. Thank you.
Thank you. Emily? You're up.
Chairman Borokoff, Chairman Fiedler, and members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the subject of China's military civil fusion strategy, or MCF. I will begin my statement with a brief overview of China's MCF strategy, followed by an assessment of some of the MCF tools at Beijing's disposal, and will conclude with a selection of recommendations for U.S. policy. In the plainest terms, China's MCF development strategy is a holistic approach to national development that ensures that new advancements simultaneously advance both economic and military development in China. Although the concept is not novel, China's MCF strategy under Xi Jinping takes a new approach, one that many experts believe supersedes those of his predecessors. This presents a number of challenges and implications for U.S. policy. Key to MCF's implementation is the two-way transformation of military and civilian science and technology achievements. These spin-off aspects of MCF reflect the PRC's emphasis on dual-use technologies with simultaneous applications in both the military and civilian sectors. On the one hand, Beijing is interested in spinning on technology from civilian entities to military applications, and on the flip side, they are also interested in working to break down barriers that have prevented defense research and technologies from entering the civilian industry, thus encouraging spinning off. Beijing maintains a host of tools at its disposal to implement military civil fusion. My written testimony includes 4 specific examples, including university investment firms, industry alliances, MCF venture capital, and talent. And today I will elaborate on university investment firms and talent. Firstly, through its subsidiaries, university investment firms help to further MCF by connecting university research to the innovative commercial side of science and technology, and by extension, the Chinese defense apparatus. For instance, a subsidiary of China's Northwestern Polytechnical University's investment arm was added to the Department of Commerce's entity list in 2020 for acquiring and attempting to acquire U.S. origin items in support of programs for the PLA. Although U.S. universities are similarly involved in investment activities, mirror imaging in this context is problematic, as Chinese universities are much more beholden to Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party than their counterparts in the United States are to the U.S. government. Another key tool in China's MCF realization is talent. Chinese policy documents call for the construction of a, quote, national defense science and technology team that utilizes superior whole of society educational resources, end quote. Part of these efforts include scholarship programs like the National Defense Science and Technology Scholarship, which provides educational funding for 2,000 Chinese undergraduates and graduate students annually. Following graduation, these students are required to work in China's defense industry for a minimum of 5 years. As similar as this program may sound to U.S. Programs like the Boren or Pickering Fellowships, there are stark differences between it and its U.S. equivalents. For instance, the National Defense S&T Scholarship recipients are forbidden from making anti-party or anti-socialist remarks or participating in what are described as illegal organizations. Similar programs in the United States have no such restrictions or allegiance requirements. As demonstrated by these details, it is clear that Beijing is dedicated to its pursuit of MCF. MCF may have yet to achieve its desired endpoint in China. However, even without operating at full capacity, the progress that China has made in implementing MCF demonstrates the unique and significant challenge that this strategy poses to the United States and our allies. To enact effective policy, U.S. policymakers must have a clear understanding of their desired trajectory for U.S.-China relations. Instead of trying to incentivize change within China, the Biden administration and the US Congress should work to bolster our own ability to mitigate these mitigate the challenges posed by China while promoting collaboration where necessary and beneficial. The United States should avoid policies aimed at crippling or changing Chinese government strategies or commercial behavior. China has demonstrated time and time again that it is willing to make surface level changes to appease the international community while continuing to pursue its own agenda. To conclude my analysis, I propose the following 4 recommendations for US policy. 1. Establish an interagency working group within the US government to increase awareness of China's MCF efforts and ensure that various departments and agencies are equipped to make effective policy within their individual jurisdictions. 2. Create a repository of open source due diligence materials that can be used by academia and industry to allow them to make more informed decisions about collaborations and interactions with Chinese counterparts. 3. Provide the Securities and Exchange Commission with Chinese language and area studies resources to assist in auditing and assessing Chinese firms listed on US stock exchanges. And finally, improve the US government's ability to audit supply chains and establish industry reporting guidelines to identify significant choke points, ensure compliance with requirements, and support our allies and partners. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to discussing more during the Q&A.
Thank you very much. We will start the questioning with Chairman Bartholomew.
Thank you to our witnesses. I'm feeling actually quite overwhelmed about all of the different information that everybody has provided, and we've gone on record as advocating for more data, but I'm beginning to wonder how that data can be organized, right? I mean, when we look at what happened at 9/11, there wasn't really a shortage of information. It was a fire hose of information, and people were not able to pull out the information that would have led to knowing what was going on. So I guess I'd like to hear from all of you some suggestions about how the data could be usable by, I'm thinking of companies in particular or universities that don't have necessarily the expertise that you all bring to the table.
Who wants to be first?
Emily, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I can start with a quick point. I definitely agree. I think, as my fellow panelists pointed out, there is no dearth of information on China, especially in the open source. I think one of the first issues in kind of not only making this information available to the general public, but also making it usable is, again, the language barrier. And I think that's kind of the first step that we need to get to as far as organizing it and kind of streamlining it for public consumption. So I will say, to organize it, I think there's a way to shape it in a sense that maybe we could have, for example, an industry bucket, have an academia bucket. But I think, as we've demonstrated with, some of the things I mentioned and some of my panelists as well, there really is kind of a blending between these. And I think it's a difficult question, and I think I'm still wrapping my head around it too. But I think promoting dialogue between industry and academia and even government counterparts as well about these types of information can help to make it more digestible for audiences that maybe aren't as focused on national security.
Any of our other witnesses?
Yeah, sure. I'd like to offer some thoughts. So I think the question is a very important one and very timely as well. In 2018, we began the federal data strategy just to get a sense of what data we hold across our federal agencies and how we can better use that data. But it's mostly focused on what do we already have and how is it held and how is it cataloged, mostly for domestic-facing reasons. I think now is a great time to incorporate our China national security interest in part of that internal data audit that we're doing. But I think there's also a broader set of questions that need to be considered as well. The first is, what systems are various agencies using that have equities in the China national security problem set, and are those interoperable? Do they provide the security, access, and privacy controls required for multiple organizations with different authorities and different sort of mandates, the means by which to collaborate? I think for this reason, publicly available information is very valuable because it is without restriction that might come from more classified sources, but in many cases can produce the same level of fidelity from a sort of action-oriented point of view. I think, however, we'll also face a cultural sort of change of mind in terms of how we as a government posture towards the open source. Just because this data is cheaper does not necessarily mean it's less valuable. And I think there's actually a tremendous opportunity for us to work with allies in developing a strategy about how we better leverage cheap, publicly available data sources to make sure that we're directing our expensive assets in the collection and analysis process towards only the most intractable problems, such that that public data can help answer the lowest hanging fruit and inform more tailored policy and enforcement responses.
Thank you. Nate, anything?
Agreement with my co-panelists, and I would just add that I think an important feature, at least in the immediate, may be to think about the competitive dynamics that we're in the middle of competing with a direct strategy from the CCP, and perhaps there's need for imposing onto our own data and collection processes a prioritization logic that's informed at once by the strategy that's pursued by the Chinese Communist Party. So what sectors of interaction and integration appear to be important to them, and then also based on our own internal prioritization logic from the United States government perspective of where are our assets most at risk, which of our actors are most targeted or most vulnerable to Chinese advance, and perhaps that type of framework can be imposed onto how we think about different types of data and different types of collaborative opportunities like my co-panelists have raised.
All right. Thank you very much.
My co-chairman, Mr. Borokoff.
Thank you. First, I just want to say I think we could probably spend an entire day talking about open source and publicly available information, because almost all of the witnesses that have spoken and are going to speak allude to it in some fashion. So that's clearly a weakness we have, and I'm not going to ask a question about it because you just gave several good answers. Now you could probably talk about it at length. I'm interested, Mr. Pekarsik, in your comments about the permanent normal trade relations status, and if you would expound a little on your view of what we should be doing relevant to that.
Yeah, so in my written submission, a policy recommendation that I included was interest in encouraging Congress to debate the permanent normal trade relations status that China enjoys in this country. I think there's more than ample evidence that China's human rights records demonstrate violation of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment of the 1974 Trade Act, which should provide ample justification to open up this debate. And I think this is the type of strategic measure, even if at the point of messaging, that will draw attention of the private sector here in the United States and draw their potential action to the types of threats that we're discussing here on this panel that largely, I think, most commercial actors assume that they can wait out, that these national security risks will over time fade away, and that there's no immediate risk attached or cost attached to the types of exposures that they have to the Chinese military system.
So to be clear, what you're saying is that the nature and structure of the PNTR opens the door to a question that leads into the more important tool we need to effectively start to leverage some areas that need to be leveraged at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's mostly the attention and action of the U.S. private sector. So being able to cue that.
Wake up the giant.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'll yield the rest of my time.
Vice Chair Cleveland.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I'm looking at two different pages, and I want to make sure I get sort of the construct right. Mr. Pekarsik, you're suggesting that examples of a prioritization of a framework, we should identify areas of greatest risk, and that would include connections to China's MilCiv fusion program, government-led industrial policy, and human rights abuses, asking ourselves, does it collect or fuse and apply military-relevant technology, and then the proximity of the investment target to Chinese government entities, state-backed, state-owned. That seems to be your framework. And Ms. Weinstein, I heard you say we should think about buckets that are industry-based, academia-based, And Mr. Arterburn, if I'm looking at your testimony, it says specifically, U.S. policymakers should consider the following areas: party-state equity for financing, political exposure and industry sensitivity, market structure, and goal compatibility between the company and the party state. And then you consider each of those in turn. There's some overlap there. I think that we could come up with a coherent taxonomy. What I'm wondering is if we were able to capture all of those, we could cluster or capture those activities in some meaningful way for consideration by somebody in the government. What are we really talking about being at risk in terms of international and in particular U.S. investment? And to that point, Mr. Pekarsik, you mentioned Vanguard and Hikvision. This morning we got a list of companies. Vanguard was the largest investor in SMIC, and let me see, Hikvision was the capital group. But it appears that the amounts are not substantial. So even if we organized ourselves in a meaningful way to collect data, to apply it for outbound investment, I'm wondering what we're really talking about in terms of stakes that U.S. investors, institutional and otherwise, have in these companies that you've identified as national security risks.
If I may go first, thank you. This is a tremendous question, and I think that it's not the simple point of capital that's exposed. Instead, it's the confluence of the opportunity cost and the direct cost of capital that's exposed, as well as the value that's derived on the other side. So in terms of the opportunity cost, we're funding U.S. pools of capital, funding a Chinese company that's designated as a military company or a military civil fusion contributor, is all else equal, decreasing their cost of capital, and at the same time moving pools of capital that could be supporting the cost of capital calculus for a U.S. analog. So that trade-off between the value derived on one side and the opportunity cost on this side immediately doubles the value of what we're talking about. And then from there, there's a degree of legitimacy that's afforded to these actors, which then allows them sort of compounding effect to go out and participate in global markets and have some degree of legitimacy be bestowed upon them by having pools of U.S. capital supporting them. And then we have the sort of downstream of thinking about which of these actors pose the most immediate and direct threat. So in some cases, in pure civilian companies, perhaps this is not so egregious, and this guarantees that these actors participate in global trade and we can monitor what they're doing through publicly available information, and maybe that's a net positive. But in other cases, we're clearly going to have examples where the value derived on the Chinese side does produce immediate outcomes in terms of research and development, in terms of military program contributions to the PLA, as well as capacity to project power and to alter the cost of empire calculus. So how China positions itself globally, how it retains information that can feed back into this system. It's difficult to assign a direct immediate value, but there is this confluence of factors that there's no other way to address at the root cause other than by capital.
Well, and I'm also mindful of what Chairman Bartholomew raised this morning, which is we don't want to wait until problems become enormous in terms of the size of capital investment. But I do think it's important in terms of raising concerns with our colleagues on the Hill that we identify what the scope of the threat is, not just, and I think that was a brilliant presentation of opportunity costs, but what's the actual value? And I think that's a key question to ask, Mr. Arperton and Ms. Weissman.
Sure, yeah. No, I think you ask a very important question that sort of in identifying risk in the Chinese commercial space, we need to first ask ourselves sort of what is at greatest risk in the U.S. national security interest. Risk is a function of vulnerability, consequence, and scale. And so we must first sort of audit what are our national interests and where are we most vulnerable and which vulnerabilities, if exploited, would result in the greatest consequence to our national interests. And I think if we look at examples of how the Chinese state and Chinese actors that may not be aligned with the state have compromised U.S. national security interests over the last few decades, there are several examples. Some are things like technology transfer. Others are things like political interference through illicit dark money in campaigns in democracies. And others are sort of using front companies to make investments that are adversarial, I think is the term that some have used. So I think to really answer that question, there's really sort of a first order audit that we need to do and understand where are we vulnerable in a systemic sense, in ways that people may be able to contribute money to political campaigns without proper disclosures, where companies may not need to disclose their beneficial owners, in ways that would allow us to understand who is ultimately behind those companies, or maybe where our universities don't have the proper disclosure systems that would allow us to identify where a Chinese state actor might be involved. Now, this is sort of a much broader policy conversation, I think, but speaks to really the systemic nature of the solutions that we need to pursue, some of which are domestic-facing, but I think are really our best chance at having a durable, sustainable solution from a policy point of view.
And I would just go ahead and echo what my co-panelists said and just add briefly too that I think when assessing the risk that China poses to the United States, I think we need to think about these in terms of different buckets of risk. What is actually at risk? Are we thinking of instances where health information or PPI is at risk? Are we thinking of information where proprietary technology or specifically defense technology or information is at risk? Or are we thinking, like Jason just mentioned too, are there instances where our democracy is being put at risk by things that China is doing? And I think each of these buckets of risk will take a different type of cost-benefit analysis as far as determining collaborations or interactions with China or how we interact with China moving forward.
Okay. I think we've broadened the problem rather than narrowed it in some ways. And there's a lot of conversation, and Commissioner Wong mentioned this morning the desire for some kind of outbound CFIUS organization, and that has some merit, but I'm now not sure how to think about how we wrap our arms, what the taxonomy is, what the standards would be, what is it that, because democracy and proprietary technology and tech transfer are just, they're large categories, and having served in government, I'm not sure I'd like to turn over to anybody that kind of a broad notion. So if you have thoughts for the record afterwards on how we might narrow this, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you very much. Jeff, you're muted, Jeff.
Jeff, you're mute.
I'm sorry. I want to continue this discussion that Robin has raised. We have restrictions in place currently, and there's a discussion about whether some of those restrictions are proper or not. So there's a targeting issue, number one, and and some of you have already talked about priorities. And then there's a expectation of a reasonable process on the part of our government before they put these names out there and restrict investment in these entities. So, there's a major difference between somebody who is providing the innards of ballistic missiles versus lug nuts for Jeeps for the PLA. And so, but everybody, and it seems to me that the government should be obviously prioritizing those that are most important. And to Robin's point that you don't necessarily want people in the government always to be deciding all of these things, then there seems to be the necessity for some outside cooperation in that at least contributing information to the decision-making process. And I get that it's layered on top of interagency, this, that, and the other thing. So it's critical, and complicated. Now, but we're presented with that problem today. We have issued restrictions. Are they fair? Are they not? How should we proceed as a government?
Jeff, could I just correct one thing? I didn't say
Yeah.
I didn't want the government involved. I just don't want them handed something that is so large and unwieldy that we
No, I'm sorry.
enhancing the problem rather than
No.
solving it.
Yeah, no, I mean, what I think I meant was that we don't necessarily want the government to consider only its own information and not anybody else's. So comments? How do we structure this?
Sure. No, I think it's a very important question. And I think the threats from China have been described as a whole of society threat. And I think we need to imagine whole of society solutions. And that is a way, I think publicly available information is a way that we can engage key stakeholders. The example of what constitutes a dual use good that meaningfully could contribute to the PLA's capabilities. We really need the specialist community, which includes academics, technical folks in industry, to contribute some answers to that question of which lug nut is actually going to help the PLA make a better missile. And we can only do that if we're willing to engage and we have a mechanism through which to do it, which means that we're more willing to have open conversations with those broad range of stakeholders who can contribute important perspective there. I think that the last note that I'll make is that sometimes it's in the national interest to collaborate with China, and I think that it is important that we have the means of having a more detailed and nuanced understanding of where risk specifically lies so that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in removing opportunities where there might be a productive way forward.
Emily, Nate, anybody?
Yeah, I think I'll add briefly to Jason's comments as well. I think in adding certain types of specialists who, like Jason mentioned, could identify this specific lug nut that is useful to the PLA. I think that is kind of it's a difficult thing to do, but I think stepping back, I think there's a place to kind of look at what China is saying as far as what their strategic industries are, because I think that, if China is proclaiming that they want to improve their capabilities in biotechnology or in new energy vehicles or things like that, they're pretty much handing us kind of their goals for the next 10, 20, 50 years. So I think as far as deciding where the US should look as far as maybe protecting our own industries or kind of where we need to direct our educational resources to, I think taking a look at Chinese policy documents and really saying, okay, China, the 14th five-year plan just came out. We see that they're interested in these specific sectors. Let's make sure as the US government that we go ahead and start to talk to people, both who work, in academia in this sector and industry, and try and work with them to kind of not only give them a better understanding of the challenges posed by China's interest in this sector, but also to kind of work with them as they navigate collaborations or interactions with Chinese counterparts.
Thank you. Okay, Commissioner Goodwood.
Thank you, Commissioner Fiedler, and thanks again to the witnesses for their great testimony. Mr. Karczyk, I wanted to talk a little bit about investment restriction. We touched on this in our first panel this morning, but you in your written testimony discussed the executive order that has designated, pursuant to which some companies have been designated as being subject to certain restrictions, and you were pretty clear that for these restrictions and that executive order to be effective, it will require and necessitate clear and consistent implementation. In that first panel, I raised a question about a recent court decision issued by the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia regarding the company Xiaomi, who obtained a preliminary injunction preventing the application of those restrictions. That company and a lot of the media coverage has played additional litigation along the same lines. I want to ask a bit of a different question, though. In your testimony, I think you point out that even the efficacy of these restrictions still raise a more fundamental question, which is what good does it do to restrict investment in these companies if large American investment firms can still invest in those same companies, affiliates, or public entities? Which to me raises some political questions here. How could those sorts of restrictions and those sorts of concerns be raised and implemented? And on the heels of the decision by the district court last week and the prospect of additional litigation, will that make it more politically difficult domestically to pursue the sorts of restrictions, or at least assess the sort of restrictions that you may be suggesting in your testimony?
Thank you. I think this is a fantastic question. It speaks to the core of the task at hand immediately and the importance of this dialogue. So again, thank you for the chance to contribute, and thank you for convening this discussion. I think that I would actually point to the points that my co-panelists have raised, that there is sufficient information available from primary source Chinese language, publicly available information to document the scope of China's military civil fusion strategy, apparatus, ecosystem, and to document the role of actors therein. And I think that the task that allows us to implement is a collection one and an analysis one that addresses the scope of military civil fusion, documents it clearly, and communicates that documentation and analysis in a more rigorous fashion and in a more transparent fashion. And I think there's a guide to do so offered in the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act that reauthorizes the original military company tasking from the 1999 NDAA. So that's probably the first place that I would look in guaranteeing that Congress implement that guidance and that it resource the authorities in the U.S. government that are tasked with carrying it out appropriately. So I think Emily previously mentioned staffing SEC with Chinese linguists and analysts. I think that there's probably a need for guaranteeing that even in the DoD, intelligence community, Treasury offices that are implementing these measures, that they also be receiving the appropriate scope of resources and type of staffing to carry out the task.
Well, but more fundamentally, if on the heels of a loss in a court case and the prospect for additional adverse decisions, do you think that will affect the political appetite to move forward with the sorts of initiatives that you're discussing, especially in the face of potential pushback by business and industry groups?
Yeah, I think it's going to impact the political appetite, and it's going to fuel, as you're suggesting, the private sector impetus and interest in combating these types of restrictions and measures. There will be active measures taken by Chinese Communist Party affiliated individuals and entities to engage in information and legal competition on these fronts. I think we need to, be certain that that's the case, and I think that really the only solution to that within our system as it exists, adhering to the norms and values that make our economic model work, is to be transparent and documenting clearly the violations that we see. So I think that even in this case, I would suggest that there's material that should be made more public about this individual designation and decision. I haven't reviewed in extreme detail any of the disclosures made as a part of the case, but my suspicion would be that there's available public information that hasn't been considered by either side of that dispute that might be and should be made available.
Sure, and I certainly wasn't asking or opining myself on that individual case, but just in the abstract, in the face of these adverse decisions, was curious as to what you thought, what sort of impact that would have on our efforts. So thank you very much.
Commissioner Goodwin, if I could just quickly add a point, just briefly on the Xiaomi, I know we're tight on time. I just think one of the things that I noticed in looking at that injunction from last week was that as good as the DoD and the NDAA's definition of military civil fusion is, and how well they, in my opinion, define what a Chinese communist military company is, I think this case shows the need for, it's great for everyone to have a kind of solid definition of MCF across the US government. But I think in particular, individual offices, departments, agencies need to be able to develop their own types of more succinct and more applicable definitions of military civil fusion so that they can use them as a policy tool within their individual jurisdictions. And I think this was a case maybe where the definition of military civil fusion or a Chinese military or a Chinese communist military company might have been too broad, and therefore Xiaomi was able to kind of find ways to circumvent some of that.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Camphausen.
Thank you to all of our panelists. It's been a terrific panel so far. Mr. Arterburn, your bottom line, I'm quoting here, is China's political economy poses systemic national security risks to the United States. So that's either a blinding flash of the obvious, or given the work that you've done in this area and the breadth of the rest of your testimony, really prompts me to ask, what is unique? What has changed? Why are you saying this now, right? Is it so different from an earlier point in your analytical career? Is it that, and in the end of this section, you quote Jude Blanchette's piece and talks about CCP Inc., focused on creating an entirely new political economic order. I mean, is that, I want you to spend a little time fleshing that out. I think for some of us who've been at this a while, military civil fusion is the latest iteration of a long-standing trend in China on the part of the party and the military to leverage that which was better in the non-military part of the economy for military use. But it'd be helpful to hear your view, and then also Mr. Pekarsik's and Ms. Weinstein's, on whether it's qualitatively different, right? Has a threshold been crossed, and we ought to think about it, military civil fusion, in ways very distinct from the past? So 2 questions. First, why now would you say what you say here about China's political economy posing systemic national security risks? I smile when I read it because it's self-evident at one level, but really that's a prompt to get you to talk more about your why you would emphasize that at this point. And then the broader question to all three, if we have time, what's different about MCF from past patterns of behavior?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and I've actually asked myself that question before I published it. Is this not obvious, or is this actually a new idea? And so I think the way that I've sort of come to it in my head is that I've gotten the sense that the most recent policy conversation, as our community has achieved consensus about the threats that China poses to the United States, has seemed to overstate the role that the CCP plays in the economy, as if to imply that we need to establish a CCP operation or CCP connection in order to state its urgency, while overlooking, I think, some of the more fundamental and banal ways that China's domestic economy, in which there is collusion as an endemic feature, poses certain national security risks where we don't necessarily need to find a state connection for there to be an urgent problem that we need to address. So the one example I would give would be from Wall Street Journal's reporting last June, where a satellite company called, Huaxun Fangzhou, the chairman of the board of directors who sits on the All China Federation of Industry and Commerce was in the United States as in the capacity as the chairman of a company that is publicly traded, attending fundraisers and political fundraisers in the United States. Now, that is perfectly legal in many ways. By US standards and by US campaign finance law, there was no wrongdoing necessarily found. But what it means is that we have a certain vulnerability where someone who sits in formal political institutions within China may be able to participate in our democracy and our system in ways that, simply because conceptually we're not treating it as the same issue, might sort of fall through the cracks and undermine our interests in ways, while they're pursuing perfectly normal and licit commercial interests to maybe increase profits in a new important market where there's a significant market for technology products in the satellite space. And we need to be more attentive to those more domestic and systemic features. And so I seek, when I use those words, to draw it out. And I think what's fundamentally changed, to your second question, is both the scale of this with the top 100 conglomerates being 500 companies and now 15,000. And also the urgency of it, with the volume of Chinese companies that are now pursuing globalization and impinging on U.S. interest and in U.S. markets in new ways, whether it's through capital markets domestically, direct investments and acquisitions, participation in joint collaborative research with American universities and others.
Before Nathan and Emily address the second question, I mean, your analysis of the problem really begs a comparative methodological answer, right? Would we see similar patterns of behavior on the part of Russian oligarchs, albeit with Russian characteristics? That's beyond our writ, but it does suggest we need to understand this piece of the problem in more nuanced ways than we have before. Okay, Nathan.
I think the only thing that I would add, and I think complete agreement on the scope question, would be that what is available with that scope as a function of changes in the security environment. So we do have a point where we are today, possibly at an inflection where new types of technology, new rules that govern those technology are likely to be locked in some capacity for some amount of time. And at that pivotal sort of inflection moment, it might be more important than other times, particularly given the relative balance of power, to pay more attention and be more active in defending against the risks that I think completely agree have been largely evolutionary within the domestic policy system in China and the concept of military civil fusion. So I think we can respond to the national elevation of this policy within China, but as much or more so, it's changes in the security environment that present different, and perhaps more immediate type risks in this current period.
Okay, Emily, you have anything to say?
Yeah, I would just add too, I think, again, besides the fact that, military civil fusion has been elevated to a national level strategy under Xi, I would also add the piece to me that stands out among many that is, I think, unique at this point in time is, again, this spinning off side to military civil fusion. Whereas previously we've seen an emphasis on, okay, the commercial side in China, the civilian side is going to be where the most innovation is happening. We're going to try and funnel some of that technology and know-how to the military. And now we're seeing the opposite of that. We're seeing the Junjuanmin, so the transformation of the spinning off of military technologies into the civilian sector. To me, I think what, among kind of the many implications that brings for US policy, I think it hints at kind of where Xi Jinping and where Chinese leadership see the PLA and its military modernization process. I think showing that there are certain technologies on the military side that are good enough to compete in the civilian sector or civilian industry, it should be kind of a wake-up call to U.S. policymakers to say, oh, okay, hey, China's military capabilities are improving, and they're getting to the point now where, again, they can compete with what were previously thought of as the more innovative entities on the commercial side.
Thank you. Commissioner Scissors.
I was going to ask a version of this question that Robin asked and then Jeff asked, and so I'm going to make it more pointed. Either I didn't understand your answers or you guys didn't give very good answers, and I'm going to try to force you to answer in a way I understand. Congress is working on how to structure this in terms of, I'm not saying they're only doing this, but they're definitely doing this, how to structure our approach in terms of sectors. Key sectors for outbound investment restrictions if we're going to adopt them, key sectors to evaluate in supply chain security, key sectors to evaluate in terms of export controls. I want you guys either to tell me I'm not doing that. I am not going to structure our response by sector, or, and tell me why, or tell me what you think the key sectors are. I want one of those two things, because that seems to me like a really obvious way to answer the question. It's a way policymakers are trying to answer the question. If they're wrong, then let's push back. But if they're right, I want more specific answers than what you've given so far, without putting words in Robin or Jeff's mouth, but they led me down this path. And so all three of you, I don't want to use sectors, or these are the sectors where I'd start. Emily.
I'm happy to start. Thank you. I would say, so I am willing to go down the route of identifying specific sectors. And I think it ties back to the comment I made earlier about looking at For example, in the 14th five-year plan or one of the policies that's come out, I know China usually updates their catalog of strategic emerging industries around this time as well. So I would say a great place to start as far as where we want to start limiting access on a sector by sector basis would be to look at specifically what China has said is key to their goals moving forward. So I don't have the 14th five-year plan in front of me at the moment, but I would say that's at least a good place to start.
Nate, Jason?
Yeah, I would agree. So taking the scope of ambition offered by Chinese planning documents, and then I would add filters for the current balance. So China's role in a given sector. So there are going to be some where China already has an outsized position, so it should cause some degree of concern. Susceptibility to vertical integration would be another, which is a precursor for the Chinese dominance in a particular market, either as a consumer or producer on either side. And then there's probably a separate set that should be prioritized that is just strictly based upon military relevance. So as we think about dual use and commercial inputs, we shouldn't lose sight of things that are the obvious right now, the innards of the ballistic missiles, as Jeff mentioned earlier, and those should be the first.
I'll go ahead and offer some specific ones that came to mind from the framework that risk is a function of vulnerability and consequence. So the first is rare earths, where we have a dependence and China has a significantly greater supply and capacity. The second is agriculture, where we have a significant capacity and China is particularly vulnerable. And so for outbound investments, it might be worth focusing on. The third is on critical technologies of the future that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence has indicated would be dramatically consequential to U.S. national security if other our adversaries were able to make significant leaps and bounds. So that includes things like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and others. The fourth is on semiconductors and batteries, which are both part of China's stated priorities, and you see that in their investment activity domestically. The sixth is on energy, where China has strategically used state-owned enterprises and private military contractors around the world to ensure that it has stable access to things like fuel, on which it is dependent on imports. And the seventh and final is on biotechnology and genomics, where there's obviously significant interest right now with developing vaccines, but where also there would be a dramatic consequence from a counterintelligence point of view if China and Chinese companies were able to acquire a lot of that data. So those are the seven I would start with off top of mind, based on the idea that risk is a function of vulnerability and consequence.
Thank you. I appreciate those answers. And maybe I just, didn't parse them out, but I feel more enlightened now, at least. I will close with a comment. All of you started with what the Chinese are doing. You didn't just necessarily end there. I mean, we could have started with what the U.S. wants to do, and give Chinese goals and even status, make that secondary to our goals and status. And I'm not sure that that's the right thing to do. I'm not advocating it, but I will say that we are bigger, richer, we're more technologically advanced, we're younger now. We have a lot of advantages, and they may argue for starting on the American side and pushing it against the Chinese rather than responding to China. I'm not sure. I just thought I'd bring that up, and I'm sorry to go a little over time. I'll stop there.
That's quite all right. Is Senator Talent back yet? Then we will move to Mr. Wessel, Commissioner Wessel.
Thank you all for being here. A lot of questions. I want to tee off of something that Senator Goodwin, though, raised earlier today and again in this panel, which is the Xiaomi case and the question of the injunction. To me, I think it's time to change the burden of proof, create rebuttable presumptions that with the opacity of the Chinese system, as well as their unwillingness to abide by certain norms, for example, transparency with regard to accounting, etc., that I think we are right to take certain actions we believe are in our national security interest, broadly defined, and China can earn its way back. can earn its way off, if you will. This goes to entity lists, this goes to the DoD companies. It goes to areas like pharmaceuticals, where China has refused access to substantial percentages of their drug-producing facilities to FDA personnel. We have certain basic interests that our public is interested in us pursuing. Not every definition is correct, and we have to continue to adapt them. But what do you think that, since China is not a rule of law nation, that we should move first and worry later? Nate, do you want to start with that?
Sure, Commissioner Wessel, thank you for the great question. I think the framing is spot on. If we're able to scope to national security relevant domains and leverage the Chinese definition of military civil fusion for doing so, I think we're able to flip this presumption. I don't know what the correct legal or bureaucratic mechanisms to do so would really be, and that perhaps suggests that there's a need for new or different bureaucratic authorities or interagency capacities on the part of the U.S. government. But I think we have ample evidence at this point to understand that China's not going to change its orientation toward the rule of law, its compliance when it concerns military civil fusion and national security relevant capacities with accepted norms and standards globally. So I am entirely sympathetic and I agree with the idea and principle, and regrettably don't know that I have any real concrete suggestions for how to implement.
If I could.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, I would like to offer one concrete recommendation. I think I can agree with the premise that there's a certain level to which we cannot necessarily force China to change its ways or its approach to be transparent, reciprocal, and maybe have integrity in certain business or academic interactions in the way that we understand it in the United States sense. But there are tools that we can use to force their hand in certain ways. And I think the lowest hanging fruit from my point of view would be require that Chinese companies that invest in the United States or register in the United States also include their Chinese script's name in disclosure documents. And the reason I recommend something that basic is such that when an investigator who needs to know who owns this company, who is related to this company, wants to go in Chinese public records that are free to access to understand shareholder investor information, need to have the Chinese name to do it. And in most cases, the discrepancy between a Chinese company's English and Chinese name can be dramatic to the point where it's impossible really to hunt that company down in English. So things like the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control publishes lists of Chinese company names in Chinese, and that's dramatically helpful for those of us who do investigations and analysis on a lot of these corporate networks. But as based on the previous National Defense Authorization Act, where we've begun to establish a national beneficial ownership registry, that is one concrete place where if we require Chinese companies that are registered in the United States in some way to include the Chinese name of their company as well, it will increase and accelerate the due diligence process in such a dramatic fashion and allow us to start really sort of scaling up our own sort of protective due diligence measures at home. So that's the most immediate lowest hanging fruit I can think of to sort of force some transparency in our own domestic systemic reforms that we might pursue.
And I appreciate that, and any other ideas you may have there that we can talk to Congress or recommend to Congress. But I think we have to do more than baby steps. We need to take some giant strides right now based on the challenges we face. Emily, any thoughts?
I was just going to say, I completely agree with the idea that we need to stop putting the onus on the Chinese government to be transparent. They have proven time and time again that they will say that they're being transparent or that Chinese companies are being transparent. And then later we find out that they are not. So I think, I love the idea that Jason threw out there. And I think too, my recommendation for providing Chinese language and area studies resources to the SEC would also be very helpful, because I know that the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board has struggled over the past, 2 decades with getting, trying to work with Chinese accounting firms and Chinese government entities there to get the necessary materials that they need to audit and investigate Chinese companies that are either listed in the U.S. or trying to be listed in the U.S. The only other thing that I would add too, and I think, there's a lot of conversation recently going on about whether or not to delist certain Chinese companies from U.S. stock exchanges. And I think there's really an important calculus that needs to go into these decisions, because in some instances, the companies or the information that these companies need to provide in order to be listed on the U.S. stock exchange, that provides a lot of information for in the open source for U.S. government, for other analysts to kind of assess these intercompany workings. And I've struggled over the past few years trying to get access to certain things on the Shenzhen or Shanghai Stock Exchange. It's much more difficult, and I assume now moving forward, as easy as it is right now to get things on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, I think it's going to be more difficult as we see things in Hong Kong really shifting. So I think in some instances where there are maybe cases where the Chinese government or Chinese military is very tied into company inner workings, I think there's an argument to delist them. But I think it's important to keep in mind, again, the lack of or the loss of certain open source details that might be useful moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my questions and really some of my comments are directed at Mr. Arterburn and Ms. Weinstein and some of your recommendations regarding having the government become more of a clearinghouse or a source of analysis and information on Chinese at the Chinese market and at the sectoral level and even at the firm level and the connections between these ostensibly private firms with the national security policies of China. So one observation, which I just find interesting, is generally people will say that the relative difficulty of the Mandarin language and Chinese written language is a hurdle to China in its ability to expand or to attract investment, to conduct trade, to acquire talent from abroad, and to expand its soft power. But it also, on the other side, as I'm hearing from you, it has the effect of insulating their strategy, insulating their country from strategic analysis, from basic business due diligence. So it's interesting. At the same time, it's a hurdle. It's also perhaps a shield from some of the analysis that we'd like to conduct on their market. That's just an observation. Second, I agree with you, Mr. Arterburn, that the open source opportunities here are great. As a general matter, the delta between open source analysis and sources versus those that are classified is relatively small in my experience. Maybe it differs between what you're actually talking about, you're analyzing, but as a general matter, I think that the delta is pretty small. And here, the actual data that's available, as you're saying, is quite voluminous because of the simple fact that China's strategy to boost its capital markets, that military civil fusion, it has to be in large part public for them to marshal their entire population and the entire business community to their ends. So it's available. So I agree with you on that. That's a second observation. And the third is kind of just I want to clarify or maybe put this in terms that I would understand and see if you, Mr. Arterburn, you, Ms. Weinstein, agree. You both are proposing that the United States government do something somewhat unprecedented, which is to enter into sectoral and firm-level analysis for investment quality, perhaps even some things that rating agencies do, something that has largely been private sector and proprietary type research, having a government role in that. But you're proposing this because we are facing a situation where there is an unprecedented government and national security valence to the market in China. So we have to somewhat mirror that in our efforts. Am I phrasing that correctly?
No, I think so.
I was just going to say, I think yes to how you're phrasing it. I would just also point out too that I think there's a capacity for this to maybe be directed or led by or I would say directed by the U.S. government, but not necessarily undertaken as a wholly government effort. I think this is something that could be outsourced to think tanks in the U.S. There are plenty in Washington, D.C. that can do amazing work on this. I think even working at some type of public-private partnership, even something like an FFRDC or a UARC, that gets certain types of mandates from the U.S. government as far as its research capacity and what it is investigating. But that way, it's taking the onus again off of the U.S. government to entirely undertake such, as you've mentioned, such a large issue.
Right.
I think the point I would like to add is that whether we like it or not, as you said, there's an unprecedented threat, and it can't be just the government and the federal government to take it all on. We need the state level governments as well to understand what the threat looks like, how those networked threats actually might sort of come and appear. And I'm from Alabama in Huntsville, where there's a significant amount of our missile defense research. And we need the resources to be able to take action against those threats in a timely fashion, in a way that maybe not is unencumbered by sort of restrictions on information sharing. And I do agree, I think there is a degree of it which is unprecedented in the terms of who we might need to engage as collaborators or stakeholders who have a role to play in mitigating and responding to risk. Because, as you said, it is unprecedented in the scale that it takes and also in the form that it takes. I think another key challenge here that we have to be able to address is the fact that not everything is illegal. And approaching all of these threats from the perspective of criminality, I think will also potentially lead to certain overreach in ways that are going to be counterproductive in the long run. And so we also do have to think of new policy tools and levers that we can use to sort of frame and understand and respond to some of these threats, which may not require an enforcement mechanism necessarily, but might be something more benign or local or targeted.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you that not everything can be listed on the entity list or on the SDN list, right? There has to be some sort of different medium by which we can raise, pretty vexing issues that are presented by the Chinese hybrid model of fusing its national security interests with the commercial interests, whether that's through advisories or bulletins, and investors can take it as they may to make their investment decisions. But obviously, when you have the U.S. government backing, whether it's through public-private partnerships or through an actual government statement, it will carry certain weight, right? It will have to be factored into investment decisions, particularly by publicly traded companies. That leads into my next question. I know I'm over time here, but there's been a lot of discussion here in this panel and from prior ones of the need for international coordination. Usually that relates to restrictions, that if we don't place restrictions in a coordinated manner, it's simply we're permitting other investors or non-U.S. investors to fill the space. Here, however, if this information is a public good. You put out information, it has the authority of the U.S. government that will not be ignored by investors worldwide, in my view. But we could also, I'm assuming, and perhaps you should jump in here, Mr. Arterburn or Ms. Weinstein, we can pull information from other countries as well. They perhaps know even more about the China market than we do. I imagine sophisticated investors from Japan or from Korea or from in the region actually have better insights into this.
Yeah, I would totally agree there. I think part of my recommendation about a U.S. national data strategy, I think my goal is that would be in coordination with a lot of our allies who have both similar vulnerabilities and also unique capabilities that can enhance ours. And if we sort of distribute the effort for a problem that is of significant scale and that is growing in sort of its scope, I think we're going to be in a better position to respond to it. But I think another important point here too is that these threats don't necessarily manifest bilaterally. And one example I would say is from a DOJ indictment from about 2 years ago on Beijing Highlander technology, where Chinese companies procured U.S. sensitive goods from a Houston company via front companies in Canada. So working with through our allied countries, where theoretically, if we had the right information sharing mechanisms, we might be in a better position to respond to things that might be sort of compromising our interests across those borders. So I totally agree with the premise that I think part of this needs to be in coordination with our allies, not only because we can distribute the resources required, but also because our allies have unique capabilities that can improve and enrich our own understanding of a threat in which we all have very similar equity and interest in sort of buttressing our systems.
Thank you.
And I would,
Go on.
apologies.
Please.
Just one more point too. I'm sorry to keep going on this, but I would just point out too, but beyond restrictions and information sharing, there was a great report that came out from the Center for a New American Security. I would say within the past year or so, about building a like an alliance innovation base. So it's not only focusing on placing restrictions in international technology or kind of sharing information, but also working to improve our own technological capabilities and ability to compete, not unilaterally, but multilaterally. And I think as we move forward, that will be super important as far as competing with China.
Thank you. Chairman Bartholomew, you have a second round question?
Nope, none here, thanks.
Bob, does anybody in the main room have a second round question?
Yes, Commissioner Camphausen does. Oh, sorry, he was waving and saying no. So the answer is no.
Anyone else? Is Commissioner Talent back yet? I just want to make sure everyone has an opportunity.
Can I just quickly, Jeff, and thank you all. Last year, the China Commission suggested as one of its recommendations a new center on economic data. Would welcome, and I know some of it's in your testimonies, where you think the government is doing a good job on collecting data, where it's doing a poor job. I did appreciate the information regarding Chinese language names regarding SEC disclosures. I think we have a real opportunity this year with the new administration and what Congress appears to be ready to do, and we should take advantage of it. And where it relates to data and other issues that support policy, do our best to get that those supported in law as soon as possible.
I have a follow-up.
Okay, Robin Cleveland.
Just quickly, Ms. Weinstein, you mentioned that a good place to start would be to look at our the 14-year plans as framing what their priorities are. Doesn't that put us in a position of always catching up? And I guess I'm sort of struggling with, there is some consistency, obviously, but could you clarify how you would prioritize what's in the various 5-year plans?
Absolutely. Both very good questions. To the first question, I would say, as far as kind of how the U.S. government is working on a data strategy, I think when discussing or dealing with issues associated with China, I think part of that data strategy should include some type of data maintenance recommendations. As many people know, when dealing with Chinese open source information, a lot of it tends to disappear, particularly if it gets a lot of hits in Washington, D.C. or from specific spots around here or elsewhere, and especially if it's on key terms. We've seen things like Made in China 2025, 1,000 talents, and other kind of terms disappear from the Chinese internet. So I know many of my colleagues in the kind of think tank and private sector world have spent a lot of time digging into how to use VPNs, how to archive sources, how to save documents, or save web pages or archive them in a specific time period. So I think as part of that strategy, I think we need to make sure that all the parts of U.S. government that are collecting data are well equipped to save that data and ensure that we have access to that data moving forward, even if the Chinese government takes it down. To the second question about kind of a sector-based approach, I would say I agree with the fact that, again, if we only focus on what China is doing, I think that puts us in a position, like you said, Commissioner Cleveland, to always kind of be catching up. And I think what I would probably recommend is a strategy that kind of attempts to do both. So it's a strategy that on one hand, we are paying attention to what China is doing and putting in place protective measures to ensure that those sectors specifically are safe from, for example, technology transfer or any types of nefarious collaboration attempts or things like that. But I think it also puts us in a position to look at these sectors and say, okay, if China wants to do A, B, and C, let's think about that. But I think, we don't necessarily want to copy what they're saying word for word. We don't want to do exactly what China's doing. The US has its own strengths. So I think there's a place, and I think one of my co-panelists, or both of them, mentioned this earlier, that there's really a place to kind of, look in domestically and see where are our strengths. What do we want to improve? Almost like, I don't want to propose that the US make its own version of, made in the USA 2025 or 2030. But I think there is a kind of place to do some type of internal assessment to say, these are the areas in which we want to improve. And then we can really kind of double down on ensuring that all players, US government, academia, and industry are on the same page.
Thank you. Jeff, I think Mr. Arberton wanted to add a comment.
And I think Mr. Talon is back. Yep. Senator Talon is back.
Yeah, I just want to make one quick comment that I think we have to also remember that, China's a very fragmented state. We're dealing with, I think, what one academic, the phrase that I love that he's used is regionally decentralized authoritarianism, where a lot of different local governments are competing against each other with how they move. And so these national level policy documents are also important from an internal state alignment perspective. And I think you see in the wake of a lot of these national level policy announcements that industry really swings to follow those documents. And so not only would we be playing catch up, but the rest of Chinese companies are also playing catch up with the release of a lot of those policies. And so I think an example I include in my written testimonies in the semiconductor industry, where after an announcement about these critical technologies in about 2018, we see, I think, several 100% increase in the amount of capital that's being directed. So that's all to say that I think to some extent there might be a little bit of catch up, and we can use things like investment data or business registration information to maybe more proactively identify where certain industries might be headed. But I also think it's not necessarily that significant because of the role that those policy documents play in aligning domestic state actors, that they're also sort of lagging behind necessarily the national government. So just a thought there.
Thank you.
Senator Talon, you have anything to?
Jeff, we're near the end, and I've been gone for 45 minutes. I'm going to pass.
Okay. We have 4 minutes. I was just, in the context of following Chinese state documents or whatever, I think clearly the Department of Defense is going to be making its decisions based upon what it knows about Chinese military modernization and which companies may be furthering that. And that is likely to be unstated in Chinese government public documents. And that is a primary consideration that motivates these restrictions, I believe, in the first place. With that, I have no more comments, and we can close this panel and take a now 13-minute break and start panel 4, overseen by co-chair Borikoff. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Don't miss out on important news. Our videos are being deleted. So if you don't want to be cut off from honest news, take a moment to sign up for our newsletter at newsletter.ntd.com so you don't lose access to NTD. Go to newsletter.ntd.com to sign up for our evening newsletter.
Welcome everybody back to our fourth panel, which will evaluate U.S. legal authority and current restrictions on outbound investment to China's capital markets. First, we'll hear from Ms. Nazak Nik-Akhtar, co-chair of the National Security Practice at Wiley and former Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the U.S. Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Perth Toll, founder of Life Plus Liberty Indexes. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Ryan LaFond, Deputy Chief Investment Officer with Algert Global. Thank you all very much for your testimony. The Commission is looking forward to your remarks. I'm going to ask all our witnesses to please keep their remarks to 7 minutes. Ms. Nik-Akhtar, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Chairman Bartholomew, Vice Chairman Dr. Cleveland, hearing co-chairs Commissioner Borochoff and Commissioner Fiedler, and all the commissioners and staff, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name again is Nazak Nik-Akhtar, and I'm the International Trade and National Security Attorney at the Washington, D.C. law firm of Wiley. And so the views and opinions expressed today, I need to say, are mine and do not represent the views of Wiley or any of the firm's clients. By way of background, I'm also a trade and industry economist, former Georgetown University adjunct law professor, and I currently completed my second tour of duty in the U.S. government. I've been on the front lines of the U.S.-China economic challenge for decades, and I'm offering perspectives from the government, from the perspective of my time in government and then private sector. Panelists discussed earlier today how the PRC is rapidly completing its goal of realizing military and economic hegemony. The Defense Department concluded last year that China has already achieved parity with, or even exceeded the United States in several military modernization areas. Well, how has this come to be? To be frank, the United States' reluctance to adequately control the flow of technology to China, our collective decision to offshore manufacturing in strategic sectors to avail ourselves to China's distorted non-market economy, and our decision to pour capital into the PRC has been for decades tilting the competitive advantage in favor of China and against the United States and our allies. And the Chinese Communist Party has taken advantage of this through its military-civil fusion strategy, rampant IP theft, coercive tech transfer requirements, and myriad of laws that compel the transfer of sensitive information to the government. The PRC has built its economy and military strength to a scale that it can now rival ours. And China has indeed weaponized capital. The U.S. public and private equity investments in Chinese and Hong Kong domiciled companies totaled by our estimates at Commerce $2.3 trillion in market value of holdings at the end of 2020. U.S. investments in state-owned enterprises totaled over $152 billion, and investments in military companies totaled nearly $55 billion. Further, the U.S. imported approximately $451 billion in goods and services from China in 2020. The aggregate value of these imports represents U.S. capital flows into China as well. These facts refute the notion that prohibiting capital flows to China makes no difference. Limiting capital will absolutely slow the growth of the Chinese military-industrial complex, and our initiatives may even prompt some of our allies to do the same. Juxtaposing the enormous size of capital transfers to China against the Department of Defense's warnings about the growth of the Chinese military, the gap in the United States' approach to national security becomes inescapable. Well, how did we get here? As a starting point, we need to acknowledge the reality that our business dealings with China have fueled the country's military-industrial complex for the last 40 years. Even business dealings where we service Chinese industries' demand in low technology, commodity sectors haven't been benign, but rather have created opportunities for the Chinese economy to shift resources away from low-tech enterprises to higher-tech sectors to accelerate its indigenization. Many of us have witnessed firsthand these dynamics and the ensuing hollowing out of industries around the world. Maintaining the status quo cannot be our strategy going forward. After Executive Order 13959 was issued in November prohibiting U.S. equity investments in the Chinese Communist military companies, the CCMCs, the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act expanded the definition of CCMCs to include entities that aid the Chinese defense industrial base through the CCP's military-civil fusion strategy. Other than equity investments, I should say CCMC designations also prohibit U.S. government procurement from contractors with CCMCs in their supply chains. CCMC designations are a start, but we need to do more. I provided a number of recommendations in my written testimony and will highlight some of them here. First, last Friday, as earlier was mentioned, the DC District Court ruled that when making CCMC designations, the Defense Department is bound by the Administrative Procedure Act to produce substantial evidence demonstrating that the entity in question is linked with the Chinese military. Here, the notion of substantial record building makes little sense. It prolongs and potentially frustrates rather than facilitates many CCMC designation. When national security is at stake, will the government always have access to substantial evidence to fulfill the mandate of the APA? How much record evidence should be required? And what are the limitations if actual evidence isn't readily available? When countering national security threats, shouldn't the law facilitate rather than impede our security objectives? Here, Congress should amend the NDAA by instituting a reasonable cause to believe standard for CCMC designations, i.e., that there's a reasonable cause to believe that the entity in question is working with or poses a significant risk of working with the Chinese military-industrial complex. This would be a far more flexible standard and reduces the record-building burden on the U.S. government. We need to be nimble when responding to national security threats. Next, we know that there are extensive and far-reaching laws in China that meld the commercial and military sectors into the same intertwined state-coordinated apparatus. In light of these CCP laws, it would be reasonable to apply a de jure approach rather than a de facto approach for designating CCMCs. Under a de jure framework, the U.S. government would examine the extent to which CCP laws and policies can be used to compel specific entities to work with the Chinese military in ways that threaten U.S. national security or foreign policy interests. If those laws have the reach, then the entities subject to those laws would be designated as CCMCs. This de jure framework has precedent in international law, so it is legally viable. This approach is also straightforward, facilitates the Defense Department's process for CCMC designations also, so it should be adopted. The third item addresses U.S. transfers of technology, just as dangerous as capital to high-threat actors. The U.S. government needs to make substantial progress in its identification of emerging technologies under the Export Control Reform Act. This would then get incorporated into the definition of critical technologies under the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. Without good definitions here, the U.S. government does not have the legal authority to adequately review exports of emerging technologies or inward FDI in critical sectors for national security risks. For over 2 years, the full exercise of these authorities has languished because emerging technologies have not been fully defined. This too needs to be remedied. Fourth and lastly, from my oral testimony, China's military civil fusion strategy is real, and the U.S. government needs to develop a comprehensive and consistent legal standard for evaluating the extent to which foreign entities are affiliated with their provincial or central governments. The lack of a framework has to date significantly impeded the U.S. government's ability to respond to national security threats in a number of areas, including export controls, investment screenings, intelligence, community risk assessments, federal government acquisitions, and Department of Defense operations. But the solution is simple. Congress should, by legislation, apply to all federal agencies the long-standing legal definition of affiliation that exists in U.S. trade laws. The laws define affiliation beyond ownership interests to the broad range of ways that foreign governments are able to exercise influence over corporate entities' business operations, such that these entities lose autonomy over key decisions. Think subsidies, think how intelligence sharing works. Think about even how financial coercion by foreign governments can induce companies to act certain ways. The affiliation laws I propose have been upheld by the courts for decades, are consistent with the United States obligations under the World Trade Organization agreements, and will therefore withstand judicial scrutiny. The goal here, by giving all agencies a strong and consistent definition, is to augment agencies' ability to increase their own legal authorities to protect U.S. national security. For example, to limit procurement from corporate entities that act as affiliates of a foreign adversarial government, or to enable the Defense Department to act offensively against the commercial arms of a nefarious central government. The ultimate point here is that we need to modernize our laws because the CCP has erased the line between China's commercial and military sectors. We must see that for what it is. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And now, Ms. Toll. You're muted.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Okay. Thank you everyone for having me here, and thank you commissioners for taking on this important issue. So I come here from the investment community to be with you today. I run a company called Life and Liberty Indexes. We are the world's first freedom-weighted emerging markets index. And so I'm here to talk with you about the investment community, the indexing community, and how we may work together to take on some of these issues head on here. So the first question that I wanted to address is from you guys is how do you view the respective roles of the government and the market in ensuring U.S. investment does not fund Chinese companies which pose a threat to U.S. national security and values? And just a disclaimer before we get started here, none of anything I say is not to be construed as investment advice or nor a recommendation to buy or sell securities. So the prevailing mindset within the investment community, and I'm speaking generally here for my peers, is that issues like national security and values are not our concern. Instead, our concern is creating shareholder value through higher profits. And again, I'm not speaking for myself or my company, but just in general, what I see in the community. Publicly traded companies like iShares and their respective index providers like MSCI report their earnings and outlook quarterly. They're publicly traded companies. So the concern of dominant market participants is typically not what's best for the world on a long-term basis, but what's best for earnings on a quarterly basis. Any responsibility for national security or values is therefore typically left to the government. The ESG movement does not change this. If anything, it's another manifestation of this mentality, which I'll discuss further below. While there's growing awareness among investors that they have an outsized China allocation in their passive funds, there's little they can do to change those benchmarks. And the large index providers are limited to standard methodologies, which I'll discuss further here. Due to the nature of these indexing standards, it would be very difficult for the large indexers to change their trajectory without policy intervention. MSCI CEO has stated that they would restrict China investments only if regulations made it a requirement. As a freedom indexer, I typically don't advocate for government intervention, and my company is here with private market solution for investors who care about these issues. But we are a very small drop in a very large ocean, and I can say with a high degree of confidence that policy solutions are needed if investments in Chinese companies are to be restricted in any meaningful way. In fact, without policy solutions, investments in Chinese companies would probably accelerate because it is a Chinese government policy priority at the moment to bring more foreign investments and foreign capital into the country. And the finance and investment industries are, generally speaking, willingly myopic to the risks and consequences of such investments. The second question you guys had is please discuss investment index providers' rationale and methodology for including Chinese securities. What role can the US government play in ensuring investment index providers consider the unique risks posed by investing in Chinese securities? Okay, so the most standard indexing methodology is market capitalization weighting, meaning the largest companies by market cap, and in turn the largest markets receive the largest allocations or weights in the index. Index providers classify countries as either developed markets, emerging markets, or frontier markets. Most asset managers will have a separate allocation to each of these categories. The largest index providers, MSCI and FTSE, are serve as benchmarks, mostly MSCI, for the world's institutions and set the country classification standards. And all of them classify China as an emerging market. So I will focus on emerging market indexes today. The emerging markets country universe typically contains around 26 countries, China having the biggest market capitalization by far as a result of its huge size and the fact that it is classified as an emerging market. The reason why it is so big, or one of the reasons, is that we continue to invest in these companies, and these indexes do facilitate that. The MSCI Emerging Markets Index has 38% allocated to China alone. The FTSE Emerging Markets Index has around 43%. So on average, it's about 40 to 41% in China alone in your emerging markets allocation. Now, in the investment world, what we would call this is a lack of diversification or a huge concentration risk. However, this is the way that these emerging markets indexes are right now. Our company is the opposite of that. We have no China allocation because we are freedom weighted, not that we are excluding China arbitrarily, just it's freedom weighted. So the freedom weighting naturally excludes some of these more autocratic countries. But we are, again, very small compared to these larger companies. So the biggest funds, or the ETFs, or exchange traded funds, which is the type of funds that I work in, that are tracking these indexes are VWO, IEMG, and EEM. VWO is the Vanguard Emerging Markets Index Fund. IEMG is the iShares Emerging Markets Core ETF, and the EEM is the iShares Emerging Markets ETF. So there's $78 billion currently in assets under management, with 44% allocation to China in VWO, 76 billion AUM in IEMG with 37% allocation to China, 29 billion AUM in EEM with 39% allocation to China. And so that data is as of March 5th, the day that I did this written testimony. So last week, as of March 5th, 2 billion in US investments flowed to emerging markets ETFs, according to Bloomberg. 1.5 billion of that went to the IEMG product, and China was by far the biggest country level beneficiary. So anytime money flows into emerging markets indexes, China is the biggest beneficiary because of its large allocation. I mean, to give you a kind of a comparison, Saudi Arabia and Russia, being the other two very autocratic countries in these indexes, have only between 2 and 3% in the index. Even more impactful to ETF flows is the fact that these indexers provide the benchmarks for all of the world's investment institutions. All the world's biggest pensions, endowments, sovereign funds, by investment policy, cannot deviate from these benchmarks. So they too must have about 40% allocation to China in their EM allocations. So in short, the largest index providers set the standards for the investment industry by providing the benchmarks by which the asset allocators of the world's institutions are measured and mandated to track. As a result, the standard in the investment industry is to have 40% in China in diversified emerging markets allocations. I see the US government's role as a regulator who won't be as swayed by state narratives and promises of market access, and who can set the rules for market participants in a country with rule of law and investment protections. In a good cop, bad cop scenario, I see you guys as the much needed bad cop. As someone that works on Wall Street, I can tell you right now that Wall Street is always going to be the good cop. We want to be everyone's best friend. So we're not going to ever say to China, without your help, we're not going to say we're not going to invest in you, because we just want to be friends with everyone. We want that market access. And again, not speaking for myself, but for the industry.
Thank you, Ms. Tall.
Oh, wait, yeah. Am I out of time?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you have much, how much do you have left? We'll give you a chance during questions.
Well, you guys had the testimony, so I'll let you ask a question.
Thank you very much. And now, Dr. LaFond.
Good afternoon. For my testimony, I'll first provide opening remarks and address really the main question provided. As way of background, I've been managing portfolios in emerging markets and specifically in China since 2007. Over this time period, U.S. investors' access to China has changed dramatically, primarily as a result of the Stock Connect program, but also as a result of increased U.S. listings and greater integration of China into the global economy. It seems to me that the main question is, what are the costs and benefits of restricting U.S. investments in Chinese companies? Well, there's clearly a cost for U.S. investors in terms of a loss of diversification. How large the loss is ultimately depends on the size of the restricted list. The penalties imposed on Chinese companies as a result of these restrictions are less certain. The majority of equity investment in China, specifically for retail investors, comes through trading of shares in the secondary market, where transactions take place between investors rather than through direct capital flows flowing into the firm. Restricting U.S. investment could potentially increase the cost of capital for Chinese companies, but this will ultimately depend on how accessible and receptive alternative capital providers are to such companies. If the intention is to reduce the potential significance of U.S. capital in foreign companies that pose a potential threat to national security, restricting U.S. investment will likely have minimal impact on the underlying behavior of these firms. However, there are alternative channels of influence, like enhanced disclosures, that have the potential to impact firm behavior while imposing less of a diversification loss for U.S. investors. We've heard today a variety of testimony about the challenges with information in China from an investor's perspective. I find many of these views somewhat dated, given how fast things are changing and evolving. I'll first note that this is not an issue specific to China, but a more general issue with investing in non-US firms and outside of the US. The information environment outside of the US is different than that in the US. In general, the information available to investors in China is better than most other emerging markets, and even better than some developed markets, but it is different. The disclosures are different, the information flows are different, and these differences don't necessarily seem anything bad or imply some higher instance of malfeasance than we observe in other markets. They're just different. We'd always favor more information and more monitoring, and this is what's actually happening and advancing quite fast in China, as China's opened up to more foreign capital. As China's opened up, we've seen increases in disclosures, monitoring, and due diligence on the equities available to most US investors. Further opening and integration into the global capital markets will likely continue this trend and ultimately continue to improve this from its current and prior levels. I'll next turn to the specific question of the role of the government and the market in ensuring US investors do not fund Chinese companies which pose a threat to US national security and values. The role of the government, regulators, and potentially exchanges should be to provide clear guidance as to what are permissible current and potential investments. There currently exist government restrictions on a variety of investments. Opposing additional restrictions is one of the many roles of regulators. The key feature for investors is that we need clear guidance as to what constitutes a threat to national security and thus would be a restricted investment. We would benefit from clear guidance around issues such as materiality thresholds for such proposed rules. If, for example, a firm produces steel that's used in making tanks and in buildings, what proportion of the firm's steel production going into tanks would pose a national security threat? The main fear from the investor perspective is that the potential rules are enacted in an overly broad fashion, impacting a variety of firms. The inclusion of the word values in the above question raises substantial concerns, as values mean very different things to different people. I have substantial concerns with the US government and regulators imposing restrictions based on values. How would the government define values and translate those values into clear guidelines for investors? Finally, I want to reiterate from the investor's perspective, consistency and transparency are the most critical features of any restrictions. If the government chooses to continue or add to restrictions, we need clear rules and precise identification of restricted securities, as well as clear guidelines as to how these restrictions are determined. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now for our first questions from Commissioner Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all our panelists. It was excellent testimony, and really the written testimony is where at least I am getting the most benefit. So very appreciate your efforts into putting together a very good written product. My question goes to Ms. Nikaktar. First of all, thank you for your recent service in government. It's fun to be in government, but you do make sacrifices, so thank you for that. You had mentioned the need to have a more precise, or at least some definition of emerging technologies as used in the ECRA. And, in your written testimony, you talk about where the U.S. government, the executive branch, is somewhat on this, or that they're aware of the issues presented with more precise definitions, vice more general definitions. But could you maybe let me know where you are aware of, where does that rulemaking stand? Is it in draft form? Is it being discussed? What can we expect soon?
Very excellent question. And so just by way of background, I also served as Undersecretary for the Bureau of Industry and Security, so have some perspectives on sort of what the initiatives were and what the challenges were. There's no question. First of all, the Commerce Department didn't need ECRA to have the authority to control emerging technologies. It always had export control authority. And so, the fact that Congress had to legislate that, I think, was just a nudge to sort of move forward. And then I think that the struggle really is, now I think in the last panel, there was a question about sort of what sectors do we want to focus on that are key to national security. Well, the Bureau of Industry and Security had produced a list of emerging technologies. And I think if we're trying to look at critical sectors, that's a really great starting point. But then after producing the list, there was no movement. And I think this goes to the importance of this question goes to how do we need to adapt our thinking and our laws based on what we currently have? So traditionally, the way the export controls worked was that we identified the product with a really great degree of specificity because maybe that product's specifications lent itself to military uses versus different specifications didn't. Now we're in the world of technology. We're in the world of emerging technologies, whereas the same type of technical specifications lend itself to both military uses and commercial uses, and also whether just slight modifications can then move from the commercial and military sector. So then the fundamental sort of philosophical question is, do we want to use our traditional methods of export controls by controlling these items with that same degree of specificity, or do we want to kind of broaden the category of controls and maybe to not impose undue burden on industry, because industry is sort of always sort of trying to pushing back and say you don't want to overregulate, and I get that, then maybe limit the controls to the countries of a concern. So because there's an impasse, the government is at that impasse. If I do it too narrowly, I don't catch everything. If I do it too broadly, one, industry is not going to have any of it, but two, do I overregulate? Then it's in my testimony, I proposed, maybe there is some merit to targeting the actors or the countries that we're most concerned with and proceeding that way. But fundamentally, just to underscore the main point of this response is that the way that we've been controlling technology doesn't lend itself to emerging technologies, and it doesn't lend itself to technologies in general. So how much is the government willing to adapt its thinking into thinking more broadly because of the synergies between the commercial and military sector?
Right. And I agree with you that the old export control model doesn't really work here, especially the technologies are emerging and not mature. But it seems to me when there's a line drawing problem like this, or when there's fear of distorting the market activity based on the regulation, that you introduce process here when you can't do a precise definition. So for instance, this seems to be an area where a formal rulemaking process is due, where you put out a draft, where you invite testimony, input from the private sector. Maybe that's happening, maybe that's not, but to hold up the rulemaking process because you don't know what the answer will be, use the APA, use the process to bring in the private sector actors and all the various stakeholders to have input into the rule. And then because you probably won't get the rule right the first time, enforce constant amendment by having a natural sunset period where there's a re-review, a republishing of the rule, a revision. I'm just coming up with these ideas in my mind, but it just seems that the urgency of this issue would mean that we should move quickly with the knowledge that we're going to make mistakes, but have room to modify those mistakes. And just one last idea, throwing it in there, instead of putting the burden on us or putting the burden on U.S. stakeholders to outline those definitions, perhaps one issue here or one solution here is to put it on the Chinese. If they put in their planning documents and their guidance documents certain sectors, certain industries, certain technologies as priorities, that is absorbed, at least presumptively, as an area which needs licensing, which needs extra scrutiny, perhaps not prohibition, but at least we can allocate our attention in that manner. Just putting those out there, I'm out of time, but if you do have thoughts on that, would love to hear it.
Yeah, Commissioner, actually, I want to address all those questions. So the sectors that were identified in the proposal for comments for BIS really were targeted based on where China was going. So we did that. We invited comments. We got a lot of comments. The problem is most of the comments said don't do anything or don't do this rather than being constructive. So it really is incumbent, I think, on industry and the government to work together to understand that we're in this together, we're rowing in the same direction, and let's be helpful to one another rather than sort of impeding the government's ability to sort of move forward on these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Wessel?
There we go. So many questions, so little time, as they say. Thank you all for being here. Nazak, if I could quickly to follow up on Commissioner Wong's comments and question. I don't know that 2.5 years is that long in government land, but it certainly is a lifetime in industry. Do you think it's possible to take Commissioner Wong's idea of simply a mirror image on what China is doing and use that as the standard?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes to sort of something that I had mentioned in the written testimony, which is, take the sectors, look at the sectors that are most critical to national security, and instead of putting controls on everything for every country, let's look at targeted actors, let's look at targeted countries. Let's not worry about all the technical specifications of AI, for example. Let's just look at sort of uses of AI, and then look at sort of having a licensing procedure for exports of certain AI type of capabilities without narrowly defining them to the actors of concern rather than the rest of the world. It streamlines the process for the government agency, it reduces the burden on US industry, but at the same time, it helps the government where it hasn't developed the capabilities or the expertise on what all AI may entail to kind of capture, at least put controls by, and that I mean, put in mechanism where at least you get to review the things that are proposed to be export to the bad guys or maybe the adversaries or the dangerous actors, and at least offer a licensing mechanism rather than not doing anything, which is where we're at now, and not having any visibility as to what's going out there.
So earning your way through the process rather than just as we see in FIRMA, where companies with minor alterations of their NICS codes are able to avoid mandatory filing altogether. Is that right?
And that's been absolutely, and that's kind of been the game in the export control world, where you can kind of quote design out of a control. And with the rapidly evolving pace of emerging technologies, we just don't have the luxury, I think, as one of the commissioners said this morning, to constantly play catch up. If we're really as a country going to be committed to being proactive and try to at least be in lockstep or one step ahead, we've got to try these uncomfortable positions. And I know they're uncomfortable, but there's a way to thread the needle by doing what needs to be done, but reducing unnecessary regulatory burdens on industry at the same time.
Let me ask you and have your co-panelists respond as well. There's so many tools that we could look at to affect some of these challenges. The challenges based on national security directly, based on values, investing, etc. What would your view be of limiting the tax benefits for any investments made in entity list companies, DoD companies, etc., so that you would not be able to take a capital loss and you would not be able to get the long-term gain? Treat it, and not provide the preferences that exist for other investments.
Look, I mean, I think first and foremost, all options, we are dealing with an adversary, I think, with the last government or last administration labeled China as an adversary of a size and scale we've never been before, and an adversary that is nimble. And so we need to, this fact is important because we need to think about all creative solutions. So what you proposed, Commissioner Wessel, is certainly creative. It's certainly forward leaning, and companies and industries can't claim lack of transparency, because I think your proposal is working off of lists that the government has already produced identifying dangerous companies. So I think there's quite a bit of merit to it. And I know that everything is uncomfortable. I know any restrictions we want to impose on ourselves are uncomfortable. But again, to the earlier point, the status quo isn't working and we need to do something, and time isn't on our side.
My time is about up, but Ms. Toll, do you have a view on that? You're on mute.
You're still muted.
Sorry, I agree.
Thank you.
Commissioner Townley.
Yep.
Commissioner Talent, your turn.
Thank you, Bob. Ms. Toll, we need more people like you in politics with your brevity of speech. That was wonderful.
Thank you. It is somewhat terrifying to be here, but it's not my normal venue. But I appreciate what you guys are doing.
Commissioner Fiedler is not as frightening as he looks, so I can promise.
Okay. Yeah, thank
Dr.
you.
LaFont, oh, I'm sorry. Let me ask you a question, and I've been struggling with these issues. Let me preface it by saying what we've been investigating recently and last year as a commission. So if you read our report last year, we have a chapter on what the PRC's global goals are. It was Senator Goodwin and I co-chaired that hearing. And the conclusion we reached as a commission, and this was unanimous, is that their goal is to overturn and or subvert the norm-based international system. The system according to which nations relate to each other, more or less, by norms, try and resolve disputes peacefully, trade, travel, on equal terms with other countries. And they want to replace that with a system, a hierarchy where they're on the top, and there are still rules and regularity, but they get to use the rules when they want to advance or evade the rules to advance Chinese national interests. And then we had a hearing, the last hearing we had was on the risk of Beijing deciding to resolve the Taiwan issue coercively. And balance of hard power in the region has shifted to the point where it is plausible that they can do that now. And if trends continue, the witnesses who testified thought they certainly would be able to do it by the end of the decade. And were they to do that, it would likely cause the collapse of our alliance structure in Indo-PACOM and would lead to all kinds of aggression and perhaps them asserting sovereign control over the South China Sea, who can ship in the region, et cetera. So the stakes here are pretty big as far as we can tell. Now, maybe all that's wrong, but I think the risk that it's right is pretty high. So if you're a policymaker in the Congress or in the Biden administration, you're Secretary Austin, you're looking at this and you're saying, you know, we want to keep those things from happening, and we want to use tools to do that, keep us as far away from an actual kinetic conflict with China. And I think that's the reason everybody's looking at, well, maybe we can constrain their aggressive capabilities by using the economic power that we have. Now, I didn't set this up to put you on the spot at all. I really didn't, because I understand what you're saying. I don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face. I don't want to put in restrictions on investment and the rest of it that hurt American investors or American business and don't accomplish anything. But given what I've just said, what would you suggest? And I know you have some ideas in there. I really like your point about clarity being very important.
Yeah.
What would you suggest that would be a good way to use our control over American capital investment in a way that sent the right message to Beijing, that kept them from developing these dual-use technologies, et cetera, or at least constrain them in that? What do you really think we might be able to do to use this tool effectively?
You know, I think first and foremost, I'd say it's difficult for us to act unilaterally. You need partners. All of which you're talking about ultimately depends on, if you restrict U.S. capital, the effect of that on the underlying firms is a function of what the other pools of capital do. And this is where, you know, I'll continue to go back to, you know, more information and more disclosure is better. Absent some effectively collective action more globally, whether it be, you know, partners, particularly within the U.S., Europe, I think the best that we can do is to try to provide more information through the realm of disclosure. And by having more information out there in the public, I think, potentially we're in a better spot. But I think ultimately, in looking at the various reports, what's been done, even our own thoughts on the topics, the main challenge with this is that you can restrict US capital flows. It is very uncertain that that will have any effect on the underlying firms. And so if your goal is to achieve some harmonization, bring in some variety of, global norms to certain things, let's say, it's very challenging to see how the policies that are being pursued when it comes to restricting investment will achieve that.
Well, Ms. Toll just said, and I'm over my time, so very briefly, that the indexes and the others have said, look, we're not going to change our conduct or change our investment patterns unless you tell us to. And I understand that from their point of view. They're not the government of the United States. They're not trying to set foreign policy. I really do get that. I don't attack firms like that for making investments that are legal. Mm-hmm. I mean, if the government doesn't like it, make them illegal, and then they'll do it. But that's what she said suggests that disclosure is, and I'm for that too, because we need to know what's happening, that isn't going to work. That they'll say, okay, they've disclosed it, we're going to continue making the investments.
I think you have a challenge, though. I mean, in understanding particularly something like the indexes and what the index providers are doing, in that ultimately they have a challenge with the amount of capital that they're trying to allocate into someplace like emerging markets relative to the limited supply of securities that are there. And the reality is, when you look at China, China is, one of the largest equity markets in the world. And China being an emerging market, of course, it's going to represent a large weight in that index. You can't take China out of that index, just like you can't take Korea out of that index and expect that money to somehow fit into Turkey. And so, again, I think it goes back to when you look at, like, whether it be a policy benchmark or whether it be what an index provider is doing, most of those index providers are looking at things like market cap and liquidity of certain segments of the markets and saying this is a representative index. Now, what is interesting when we look at this is that there is a large precedent from a variety of institutions and funds to pursue exclusion lists. And whether those exclusion lists include things like tobacco or weapons or other features, that's a very common occurrence in one of the kind of more common applications of, quote unquote, like ESG-based investing.
So,
and again, I go back to disclosure. By providing more information there, I think you have more effective tools to do that.
Okay. With the chair's permission, Ms. Toll?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead, Ms. Toll.
Thank you. So regarding ESG and the exclusions, so emerging markets ESG funds do have, again, they have to follow the parent index. So those parent indexes set the standards. And so emerging markets ESG funds also have 40% in China. They have no alcohol, tobacco, gambling, or porn, but they have 40% in a country that is committing genocide. So that is kind of the farce of ESG, and insiders in the industry all know is kind of a joke at best, and at worst it's deceptive because you're claiming to do what's best for the world, what's best for investors, when actually you're still just following the parent index. You're hugging the index and calling it ESG because you can charge more fees on top of that. The other thing that I would mention is that, our role here is in the market is not to set rules, but we can do what we do. For example, I can have a company that is freedom weighted because I live in the United States under the rule of law of the United States. Because of you guys protecting that freedom that I have through our rule of law, I can do this. I can't do this if I was in Hong Kong. I would be violating NSL national security law and I would be in jail right now. So you guys have absolutely a role there to draw those boundaries and protect our freedoms. That's, I don't see that as government intervention in free markets. I see that as government protecting our capital markets from becoming a fundraising venue for foreign powers. and is absolutely being used that way right now. There's an article that I can also attach to my revised written testimony that can tell you about how the Chinese government coerced MSCI to add A shares a couple of years ago. And so now they're in the process of quadrupling their A shares exposure. Now, granted, I will give them credit that FTSE already did this before they did. So, the Chinese government, after blaming MSCI, using them as a scapegoat for the crash in 2016-17, now they have been coerced by the same government to add more A shares. So we are not the only ones, setting the rules here. If we don't do it, other governments are intervening. So,
Mr. Chairman, you've been very indulgent.
Thank you very, very much. Commissioner Scissors.
I have a lot of questions, so hopefully there's a second round. But I will start with Nazak, and I want to impose on your broader experience. I may be thinking about this too narrowly, but it's from working with members of Congress and their staff. They think about sectors when they write legislation. So in this hearing, we're supposed to think about what sector should we look at to possibly limit investment? Maybe not. Certainly not a lot of sectors, but some sectors. When you were at Commerce, you were thinking about how to possibly limit exports of advanced technology, or how to think about supply chains. So let me give you an example of what the question I'm asking. Last month's supply chain EO noted chips, it noted batteries, it noted active pharmaceutical ingredients. Those are not emerging technologies, right? So the sectors in the supply chain EO review are very different than the sectors on the export control list. Okay, we know that. In ECRA, where's investment fit? Where would you locate investment in that spectrum? Is it like, well, really we need to starve the emerging technologies here of money? And then we have to go through the whole thing of like defining emerging technologies, as you talked about. Or is it closer to supply chains? We don't want to put money into supply chains where the Chinese become more competitive and we become more dependent on them with regard to batteries. So I'd like you to help me with, given your broad view, how to locate in the critical investment sectors compared to critical supply chain sectors and emerging technologies and whatever language we want to use. But you get the idea. There are three different categories here.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and I was actually just thinking about this the other day and talking to somebody about this. The supply chain. So if I were to prioritize, if I were sort of the president, and I can't because I wasn't born in this country, but kidding aside, if I were to sort of develop the strategy, I think the executive order on supply chains is the biggest emergency right now, because we only have a few years. We have been terrible in this country of gatekeepers of technology flowing to China. Because our technology has been flown to China pretty freely, China has sort of developed or is close to developing indigenizing semiconductor technology in China, and in many sectors has kind of raced ahead. So the biggest emergency right now is once China achieves semiconductor parity, which is only 4 to 5 years away, then China has the ability to withhold what we need in terms of critical minerals, rare earths, and then battery cells. So I think in terms of the biggest emergency right now, I think the administration is moving forward in the right direction. Let's solve this semiconductor supply chain. We're not going to keep China from having semiconductor parity, but maybe if we actually exercise the right export controls, and we can talk about that if you want to talk about which one the right controls are. If we exercise the right export controls, we can maybe buy ourselves a few more years until we figure out how to have access to rare earths and battery cells, because golly, those are the items we need for national security, and our defense capabilities will be crippled without those. So tackle that first, and then let's look at emerging technologies. They're still emerging, and frankly, those emerging technologies are going to be of no good to us if we can't get rare earths and if we can't get battery cells. So now looking at emerging technologies, we definitely do, as we were talking about, and I think Derek, you posed the question earlier, what are the technologies that we need to really look into in the spectrum of emerging technologies? Biotechnology, AI, position, navigation, and timing technology, microprocessor technology, advanced computing, data analytics, quantum, the list goes on. So the government actually has that list of what the critical sectors are for emerging technologies. The only problem, as we talked about, was how they want to go about imposing controls. Do they want to drill down further and get into the minutia, or do you want to actually just proceed and impose controls on categories of technologies and then limit the regulatory impact on industries by then targeting the foreign adversaries?
Thank you. That was very helpful for me. I'm going to jam one more question in, but it's very simple. It's from Ms. Toll. I understand and applaud your use of a freedom weighting, but if you could make the index funds that you've referred to add a more traditional financial criteria to not just heavily emphasizing market cap and the presumed liquidity in those markets, what would you add? You get one more traditional financial criteria, and you can say, hey, index funds, you need to use this one in addition to market cap. Do you have any ideas?
Okay, so as you mentioned, we did kind of solve the problem by using freedom weighting, which has 76 different variables. Maybe you can pick and choose some of those variables like transparency, rule of law, private property rights, which goes along with a size of government, the size of men in controlling private markets and so forth. So maybe it's like opacity of ownership, which has been mentioned on this panel before, but something that's measurable and quantitative. Anything that is a quantitative value can be used in indexing. So if the United States has some guidance on which countries quantitatively meet certain guidelines, then that would be useful. So so anything of that sort. Does that answer the question?
I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would something, transparency is connected to freedom, transparency is a financial indicator. Would something connected to transparency be a reasonable answer to my question? And you can pick.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that you could use. We have 76 different quantitative metrics that we use. So, there's a lot that you can pick and choose from. We tend to use the whole thing because we want that third-party objectivity. But yeah, there's absolutely there's human freedom metrics, which include both personal and economic freedom. So you can use things like how many journalists were killed, how many wars and terrorism acts were in this country. I mean, there's all kinds of metrics you can use on that, and I can talk with you offline about that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. And Commissioner Camphausen.
Thank you all for being here today and for helping us have such an lively last panel of the day. It's been a long day and we've had a lot to learn. I'd like to follow up a little bit on what Senator Talent was talking about a few minutes ago and the discussion of exclusion risks. And Dr. LaFawn, you introduced the topic. I've looked again, I didn't see it referred to in your testimony. So can you educate me and those who may not know in a very basic way what exclusion lists are, and then I'll have a follow-up.
Yeah, the basic feature of exclusion lists is that they're more typical within a lot of the European assets. They provide you with a list of firms that are not permissible for investment. Typically, that is tobacco, alcohol, and weapons. Those lists are also built based off of some materiality thresholds, typically, such that someone who produces bolts that might go into assault rifles, if those bolts are also, if that's a small portion of the business, that doesn't, that firm wouldn't be included.
Okay, who develops the exclusions list?
There's a variety of folks develop them. Typically, they come from the investors. Some of the most, I would call, rigorous exclusion lists you'll find related to some of the UCITS funds, and particularly out of some of the Nordic countries. Also, there's a variety of exclusion lists that you see coming out of religious-based organizations for the management of their assets. But they're primarily developed by the investors themselves.
And that then leads to my real question.
I can kind of. Yeah,
go ahead.
Say the Norges blacklist is a good example of that from the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway.
So at a very superficial level, maybe you can disabuse me of this notion. It sounds like If the professionals develop the lists, it's okay. But if the government provides instructions, it has to take extra care to not somehow infringe on the ability of the professionals to generate the kind of return that their clients might expect of them. Is that Dr. Lafon, is that an unfair characterization?
I would say yes, in the sense that I'll go back to, there's a variety, of investments that the government already prohibits. Particularly, you can look at, a variety of firms in Russia and things like this. Now, where I think we're challenged as an investment community is when we don't understand the criteria for the exclusions and the clear identification. And you can think about, some of the examples in the last panel of just trying to identify, if you exclude a US, the kind of name in English, trying to identify the Chinese firm or the various kind of related entities in China that would be restricted on that. And difficulties just mapping names. And so I think from an investment community's perspective, I would advocate the nice thing about the exclusion list that we're discussing is that they are very well identified. And they do come from your investors or other folks. And the criteria by which firms go onto that exclusion list is very well understood. With the recent actions related to certain Chinese entities, there is still, I would say, widespread confusion as to what the actual considerations that went into that, and also challenges, quite frankly, in just mapping the main entities and related entities related to that.
That makes sense.
I would
suggest. Hold on. It suggests that that there's really a language issue, right? It's not the language of a country, but it's the language of a profession. And so, what I hear you saying, and I think it's a fair critique, is the language that the government uses, its style, the expectations of what it wants to get accomplished are not always readily transferable in useful ways for the professionals who maybe might have done, tried to accomplish the similar sorts of things, but using different language to accomplish that.
I think that's a fair point. I would also say, that the assets that are managed related to exclusion lists are still a small fraction of the assets managed under more general portfolios. And, ultimately, the difference between the end investor's preference, whether they want to pursue an exclusionary-based strategy or a broader-based strategy.
Right. Thank you very much.
So I have a couple of points to add to that, if I may.
You can have
so
about
the
half
first
minute. Go right ahead.
Okay, so the first point is that Ryan's referring to investors like Nordis Bank. Those are government investors. So these are government entities that are investors, and we have the same here. All of our pensions that are public pensions are government pensions for public employees. So that can blur the line between government and investors, to be like retail investors. So the other thing is, I agree with him that clarity is needed, and if you have clarity in your exclusions, then we will absolutely follow them. The finance industry is very good at following compliance rules, but if there's no clarity, we will absolutely find loopholes.
I just wanted to add, sorry, with just one more point, is we've really got to think about exclusion lists where they work in market economies and non-market economies. And when you, I would probably posit that when you're dealing with exclusions lists in non-market economies, the economy is fungible. It's controlled by the central government in coordination with the provincial governments. And non-market economies do not behave rationally like market economies do. So we need to be very careful that we do not impute the same tools that we would use for a market economy to a non-market economy again, because non-market economies are simply just not rational actors.
Good point. Thank you. Commissioner Goodwin. I don't see
I
him.
don't think he's
no,
here.
he's not on the list.
I
Co-Chair
will.
Fiedler.
Yeah, so apropos the last conversation, and I'll try not to be so cynical about it, but I cannot conceive of U.S. investors coming up with an exclusion list for China when they are already unwilling to condemn what's going on in Xinjiang or what's going on in Hong Kong for fear of retaliation. Why in the world would Goldman Sachs come up with a list of companies not to invest in? I can't see any role here for that list except from the government.
I agree with that 200%. I can send you an additional article in my testimony that talk about how in the finance industry, analysts self-censor themselves.
I mean, I could make an argument
Retaliation.
that Hikvision, investing in Hikvision at the venture stage was recognition that China was a surveillance state, and if they developed facial recognition on scale, that you could make a lot of money because the government would implement it. So, you know, the China situation, I believe, is very different from every other country that we're encountering. Let me go back to an earlier discussion today. Some of the panelists raised the concept of a reverse CFIUS. And Nazak, I know that you were the CFIUS lead for commerce. And so we deal with trade through CFIUS and investment incoming. And it seems to me now we're just asking it to have one additional burden, which is to look at outgoing money with the recognition that it presents national security concerns. Is that the functioning process that we can work with to start with?
So yeah, thank you for that question. So I read an article about last week that Senator Casey had proposed some type of outbound investment screen for supply chains. Right now, obviously, the reason we're talking about all this is it just outbound investment is going without screening, and understanding the risks posed by sort of investment in China specifically, because the lines between the military and commercial sector have been blurred. Plus the fact that so much of the innovations that fuel military capabilities come from the commercial sectors. Just sort of as a policy standpoint, I think that makes sense. I think that rather than sort of trying to regulate everything, what the government can do is, again, look at strategic industries, and then maybe look at sort of high threat actors, and then review transactions with policies of denials or presumption of denials for the most risky behavior. And that way, at least industry and the financial market has some clarity and transparency. But here's the word of caution. What we are trying to do in the government is solve these problems by more regulations and by more imposition of restrictions on ourselves and more work and more burden. And so when the analogy I use is we're playing a whack-a-mole game and we've got 2 hands and China's got 100 tentacles. And at some point, when should we stop imposing so many restrictions on or so much burden on ourselves, because we frankly are a small government? And when should we just say, this is the line I'm going to draw, and I'm not going to prohibit this, and I'm not going to spend time as a government by doing analysis of this, because I already know it's a risk, I already know it's a problem, and I'm not going to waste any time with it. And I think that's the realization that at least the U.S. government needs to come to, which is to say, in Congress too, because there's more legislation, requiring the government to do more and more. And at what point are we not being effective because we're constantly trying to play catch up? We're trying to solve a problem that we'll never have full visibility to solve. And again, going back to that whack-a-mole analogy, where we've got 2 arms, China's got 100 tentacles. Who do we think is going to win? So while on the merits, I think the proposal is an interesting one, and it's certainly something that hasn't been done before. And we're talking about merits today of why a proposal like that would make sense. The flip side of the argument is how much more burden are we going to put on the US government? Plus, when we increase our burden, our ability to determine facts and do a deep dive to identify those national security risks becomes harder and harder. Doing CFIUS, it was so hard to peel back the layers of ultimate beneficial owners and assess all the risks. Sometimes I don't even think we had full visibility into what's going on in China to fully evaluate the risks. Compounding that with another review mechanism, maybe it's time just to say, this is where we're going to draw the red line and we're just not going to cross it.
Thank you. Any other comments on that? Okay. I'm done.
Vice Chairman Cleveland.
Thank you all for appearing. Important and useful. I just have one question, and then I'm going to yield the rest of my time to Derek. Who regulates the global indices, like MSCI and FTSE?
I'm scared to answer this, but no one regulates the indices. And I don't want to bring that to your attention because I am an index provider. So this is against my own interest that I'm testifying here. No one regulates us because we are not under FINRA or actually, you know what? If we have a product, like we are also an ETF sponsor, then that ETF is regulated and the advisor on that ETF is regulated, like the issuer. So in other words, iShares is regulated
by the SEC, but there's no formal.
Right. But MSCI is not. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So we have a product. Our ETF is regulated. The index that it's tracking and that sets the standard is not.
Right. I'll have some questions for you, for the record, Mr. LaForte, on standards of materiality, because I wasn't quite sure I understood it here. But Derek, over to you, or back to you. You can have the rest of my time.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I don't want to think that I'm wasting everyone's time, but I have a boring data question, but the data itself is not boring, or not boring. Nazik, and I may have got this wrong after 13 witnesses, you gave I usually have the biggest numbers for anything bad involving China. It's like my job is to create these huge numbers. But you gave a number for U.S. public and private equity investment in Chinese and Hong Kong companies. And I have written down, and I found it in one version of the testimony, is $2.3 trillion. Whoa, 500 billion in biotech, 220 billion in AI. Can you source that for us? Because one of the things that's gone on in this hearing is we've been told in specific context, no one's talked about a really big aggregate figure. There isn't enough money. It doesn't really matter if we stop, it won't stop the Chinese. Where did that come from?
Yeah, so I knew you were going to ask that, Commissioner Souza, so I was prepared. So one of the last things we did at the Commerce Department is we actually pulled a lot of publicly available sources, and we found a number that we were able to stack together that actually that figure represents, equity and positions in Hong Kong and Chinese domiciled entities, the market value at the end of 2020, but for the investments that have happened since 1992 to 2020, right? But the market value as of 2020. And so it comes from, and it also includes US investments through global exchanges and also private equity, to the extent that entities like Bloomberg had that data. So I am happy to sort of share the information with you, the database, and have the commission check it yourself or maybe aggregate more data. But I should underscore the limitations are that we only have what is publicly available and what some companies or institutions want to put out there. There has to be a more formal mechanism to track these kinds of investments and where they're going. So we needed to do better, but in the meantime, we had these snapshots, like I said, and I'm happy to sort of give you sort of all of the data you need in case the commission wants to recreate it. And it's an incredible database because you can cut and sort and look at more sectors and more companies where the money is going. You're on mute, Commissioner.
I said I definitely want that, and I might share it with the commission if they're good. Thank you. Question for Dr. LaFond. We've talked about this before, and I want to stick to time, so I'll just be really concise. And people have brought this up. You've emphasized disclosure. Will more disclosure actually change behavior in a substantial fashion? And if so, why?
We look at, I think the potential for disclosure, just based on the effect we've seen from prior literature and prior, particularly academic research, not specifically on the topic of national security, but how disclosure has changed firms' behavior, whether that be treatments related to, compensation policies and other issues. And I think what we're looking at here, in many markets, we see disclosures of things like sales to the government, more adequate or more in-depth descriptions of certain types of businesses. And providing that additional information so that you could more closely tie into how much firm sales are to various, the state government, local governments, some more specifics around some of the business activities that they're engaged in. I do think from an investor perspective, that information, we would deem that to be quite material and have the potential to very much influence some of our decisions.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Robin.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Ms. Toll.
Okay, so on that point, if the disclosure is provided by individual companies in a country without rule of law, then I don't know how much that's worth as far as how reliable it is.
Thank you. I have a question for you, Ms. Toll, from your written testimony. This is just because I don't know, and I want to understand what you're recommending from a policy viewpoint. You said that we could incentivize allocators, especially federal and state pensions and retirement plans, to use indexers and asset managers who consider these risks for federal and state plans, just like we do for ESG or women minority-owned businesses. What specifically do we do for ESG and women minority-owned businesses that could be transferred as an incentive?
Yeah, so pensions that are public pensions like CalPERS, CalSTRS, Texas teachers, things like that, have incentive to use women and minority-owned businesses. I don't know where that incentive comes from, but there is that incentive. The TRS, not the TRS, but the government pension that was kind of getting prohibited from using an index that has Chinese. Yes, the TSP. Thank you. Only uses iShares products. They cannot use others. So I don't know that that's a government incentive or if that's probably not, it's probably just a tradition. But if some of these, because some of these big players are so large and there are benefits to being that large, like cost benefits and things like that, that there's no way for anyone with an alternative solution like us to be able to make headway. We are here.
I apologize.
Yeah, sorry. So this is just, that was a suggestion to incentivize kind of even just government plans to think about these types of issues and use these types of metrics and consider them. So for example, the UN has the signatories, right? So they're making people consider ESG. But again, ESG itself is not enough because if that's a company level ESG and not considering the country level metrics. So the difference is company level versus country level. We're dealing with things that we're talking about today are country level things. These are things only governments have control over. A company operating in China cannot tell, the government what to do. So these are country level metrics that are not measured by ESG. I mean, by ESG standards, self-reported by companies, China is the world leader in ESG, and they are coming out and saying that. So that is being promoted around the investment space right now. I get emails every day in my inbox to that effect. So yeah, I just think if there's a way for us to kind of promote this kind of thinking around these types of metrics, that would be good.
So you're not suggesting necessarily an incentive. I think what you're suggesting is a requirement that
I'm actually, entire policy portion of my written testimony is going away in my revised version because I'm not a policymaker, and I realize that. So I'm going to leave that to you guys, but the incentives, I don't know where they come from currently.
Okay, that was, I didn't either, and that's why I asked.
Yeah, sorry.
Bob, we can't hear you.
I said I will yield the rest of my time to Chairman Bartholomew.
Thanks very much. A very interesting testimony. I feel in a lot of ways that Ms. Toll is trying to do something sort of in between some of what Nazak talked about and Dr. Lafond talked about, that you're trying to do a private sector response to some of the concerns that are raised. I also want to commend Nazak for noting particularly the difference between market economies and non-market economies, because I think we do the policy debate a huge disservice when we pretend that China is just a capitalist society. It's not, and I think that we need to keep that in mind. Dr. Lafond, a couple of questions. One is a sort of a comment or clearing something up. I noticed in your written testimony what you're saying about reducing the potential significance of U.S. capital in foreign companies that pose a potential threat to national security. Restricting U.S. investment will likely have minimal impact on the underlying behavior of those firms. I don't think that the goal here or the belief here is that we would stop Norinco from doing missiles, for example. But the issue is whether the United States, U.S. citizens should be funding companies that very well, could turn out to be critical in any sort of conflict that would be going on between China and the U.S. So I feel like the premise there is wrong or is different. I just interpret it differently. But particularly, I'm really interested in the fact that your degrees are in accounting. And what I think I heard you say is something that somebody earlier today said, sort of when the issue of the different accounting standards came up, is they just do things differently. And I get, I'm just really struggling with what the significance of they do things differently means in the context where people don't have access to, there's no freedom of information, there isn't freedom of the press. We don't have access to the audit work papers. How can you move forward, or how do you move forward with confidence in the information that's being provided by the companies that you are doing investments in?
So I'd start off here on a couple of different things, and just to be clear, and also I also sit on an advisory committee for the FASB. You have to look at accounting standards vary across the world. And with the FASB and the IASB being kind of like the two prominent ones. But even if we take an example of like the IASB, where many firms in different countries use IFRS, I think the best way to think about that is that effectively what the IASB is doing is setting a speed limit for each country. Each country, each exchange, each auditor, though, is kind of a different cop. And so in one country, like say Germany, you might get pulled over for, exceeding the speed limit by 2 kilometers per hour. In another country, you might have to exceed the speed limit by 60 kilometers an hour to get pulled over. And the point of that being is that even when we have common accounting standards, the implementation of those standards does vary quite a bit around the world. Now, when we look at China, China has its own set of accounting standards that have a lot of similarities to both IFRS and to US GAAP. China also, in there, they are audited. Now, the government has not released the work papers to be, reviewed by the PCAOB, but that's not to say that the accounting information within China is not audited. It is audited to a different set of standards. And I think in particular, when we're talking about large firms that have big proportions of U.S. investors, allocations, index funds allocations, there is a lot of scrutiny applied to those numbers. And those numbers are no different in their quality, and their disclosures are no different than what we would see from other emerging markets. Now, when you go down the cap scale into private markets, there's a different set of standards and a different degree of scrutiny applied. And so you do see, I think, lower quality, but for the biggest portions of the market cap, I would say the Chinese accounting, the Chinese information, the standards are very similar to what we see in other emerging markets.
So when do we no longer consider China an emerging market and giving them sort of the benefit of different standards because emerging markets have, are treated differently?
I mean, that ultimately comes down to the index providers are the ones that classify emerging and developed. Most of that comes down to different features about the free flow of capital and things like that.
There isn't, right? I mean, anyway, sorry. It's just, in some ways it feels so rigged, right? That you don't have to hold them to certain standards if you continue to consider China an emerging market. But if it's not even meeting the basic standards that it should be, then, I don't know, I guess just we'll have trouble.
But I think, there's a couple of things that are, like, first off, I think really important to understand about not just China in particular, but investments in emerging markets. As soon as you step outside of the US, the information is different. And for example, different though in some cases actually means better. China, for example, has mandatory management guidance disclosures. So China was when COVID hit and a variety of the firms in the developed market stopped providing guidance, the Chinese firms continued to provide guidance because they have rules related to that. I think that's just one example of the information is different, but for the large firms, and again, one of the prior panels made this point, particularly for those that have direct listings in the US, we actually get more and better information because they're listed in the US than if they were just listed on the Chinese stock, on Shanghai or Shenzhen. And so we're effectively bringing them closer to developed market standards.
So if I may, I agree with Ryan that MSCI and FTSE, or the index providers, decide the classification of emerging versus developed. I disagree with what he said about the different auditing standards and how they're similar to other emerging markets. Markets like Taiwan, South Korea, Chile, even Poland have mountain times better auditing standards and transparency than China. China actually has a law that says you cannot share your audits with people outside of China. So in other words, it's a state secret. It cannot be shared. That is a level of opacity that is unprecedented, even in emerging markets, if you compare other emerging markets.
But let's be clear on what that law, that is about the audit work papers, particularly that the PCAOB is actually investigating. They still have an audit opinion. And in most cases for the large firms, the audit opinion is signed off by many of the, largest audit firms in the world.
I don't care who's signing off on it. The person is checking a box. They're checking a box. They're not responsible for the actual numbers.
I think we're going to wrap this up, and I think that any commissioners that would like to send a question to the witnesses and you'd like to respond for the record, we'd really appreciate that, particularly on anything that you feel you didn't get to say. And with that, I think we're going to say thank you to everyone for a great day, and to my co-chair, Jeff Fiedler, who I know has something to say.
And no, I just want to thank the staff who put together this hearing with us and did a lot of work in talking to each of our witnesses. I think they did a very good job. Thank you.
Phenomenal. I want to ask you all to mark your calendars for the next hearing on China's evolving approach to fostering economic growth and innovation, which will be on April 15th. Thanks to everyone, and we are now adjourned.
Don't miss out on important news. Our videos are being deleted. So if you don't want to be cut off from honest news, take a moment to sign up for our newsletter at newsletter.ntd.com so you don't lose access to NTD. Go to newsletter.ntd.com to sign up for our evening newsletter.